If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 1, Prologue. An account of events from the tourney of Harrenhal to the Council of Peace. In the waning days of the 281st year after Aegon's conquest, beneath the aged and looming spires of Harrenhal, a grand tourney was convened, marking a spectacle the likes of which had not been seen in living memory. The tourney was announced a year before by Walter Went, who claimed it was to celebrate the name day of his maiden daughter. Yet, whispers flitted through the autumn air like falling leaves, suggesting ulterior motives at play. Many believed Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had orchestrated this magnificent gathering not merely for sport but as a veiled conclave aimed at addressing the madness of his father, King Aerys II Targaryen, whose reign had grown increasingly erratic and tyrannical. The events of the tourney would live in infamy, as the events that transpired here would mark the beginning of the greatest upheaval in Westeros since the Blackfyre Rebellion. Many important events happened during the tourney. King Aerys arrived unannounced, and Sir Jaime Lannister, the young prodigy and heir to Casterly Rock, was inducted into the King's Guard, to everyone's shock. However, it was the incident at the end of the justs that the tourney would forever be known for. As the tournament progressed, knights of great renown tilted in the lists, their lances shattering amidst the roars of an enraptured audience. Ladies of noble birth watched from the stands, their favours fluttering from the arms of their chosen champions. Yet, amidst the revelry, a moment arrived that would sear itself into the annals of history, altering the course of the Seven Kingdoms forever. It was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen who emerged victorious in the lists. But it was his next act that would eclipse all others in memory. In front of lords and ladies, small folk and nobles, Rhaegar rode past his own wife, Princess Elia Martell, and placed the crown of winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark. With this gesture, crowning her the Queen of Love and Beauty, Rhaegar sparked a scandal that rippled through the realm. Afterward, the lords and ladies returned to their lands, gossiping about the scandal. It was only the calm before the storm. For a year, nothing happened, the scandal at Harrenhal had faded away, but an incident would soon throw the realm into turmoil. Lyanna Stark, the spirited wolf maiden of Winterfell, vanished into the night while travelling to her brother's wedding at Riverrun. Rumours spread that Prince Rhaegar was at fault for the abduction. The news set the kingdom ablaze with speculation and outrage, but none burned with more fury than her kin. Brandon Stark, the wild wolf, was quick to act, his rage as fierce as the northern storms. He would have ridden straight to King's Landing, seeking justice or vengeance, but Hoster Tully, Lord of Riverrun and Brandon's soon-to-be good father, intervened and counselled patience and caution. He persuaded Brandon to remain in the safety of Riverrun and message his father, Lord Rhaegar Stark of Winterfell. Brandon conceded and sent a raven to Winterfell. It was decided that Rhaegar would seek an audience with the Mad King to demand the return of his daughter and uphold the honour of his house. Thus, Rhaegar Stark travelled south, not with an army behind him, but with silent hope that honour and reason would prevail. The great halls of the Red Keep, however, were no place for hope during those dark days. When the Lord of Winterfell stood before the king, demanding the return of his beloved daughter and the honour of his house, the Mad King saw not a grieving father but a conspirator in the grand tapestry of rebellion woven by his paranoid mind. Aerys ordered Rhaegar Stark imprisoned, charged with plotting the overthrow of the crown, and, with a cruelty that would echo through the annals of history, he ordered him burned to death. Rhaegar Stark, who had come as a petitioner, became a martyr. In Riverrun, beneath the banners of his allies and surrounded by the calls of war, Brandon received the grievous tiding: his father had been executed, cruelly burned alive by wildfire while the Mad King watched. The news shattered the fragile peace that had been held so tenuously since Lyanna's disappearance. The king, in another fit of madness, ordered both Robert Baratheon and Brandon Stark to come to King's Landing. The raven that bore this grim message also carried orders to Uron and Hoster Tully, commanding them to deliver these two into the hands of the king, an order tantamount to a death sentence. In the Eyrie, Uron received his king's command. It is said the calm and collected lord had gone into a fit of rage. Rejecting the Mad King's orders, he called his banners in defiance, a decision that marked the dawn of the rebellion. Robert Baratheon, upon hearing of his beloved's abduction, her father's death, and the lethal peril he faced, hastened to Storm's End to rally his own forces. Meanwhile, Ned Stark, the quiet wolf, received words from his brother and the new Lord of Winterfell, instructing him to return to the north and prepare their own for the war that was brewing. Back at Riverrun, amidst the tension and turmoil, a union was forged between House Stark and House Tully. Brandon, with the urging of Lord Hoster, married Catelyn Tully in a ceremony shadowed by war, binding their houses together. Amidst these stirring tides, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen returned from his mysterious sojourn with Lyanna Stark, only to find the realm teetering on the brink of war. Driven by a vision of a future only he could see, Rhaegar executed a bold and unprecedented move. With the weight of prophecy and the desperation of a kingdom divided, he entered the Red Keep not as a prince, but as a challenger to the throne. In a swift and bloodless coup, he deposed his father, seizing the crown in a bid to heal a fractured realm. 2 battles would decide the fate of the realm. The first was the Battle of the Trident. Leading the rebel forces were Brandon Stark, Robert Baratheon, Jon Arryn, and Hoster Tully. Opposite them stood King Rhaegar, flanked by the loyalist forces and the formidable King's Guard, including the esteemed Barristan Selmy, Arthur Dayne, and Oswell Went. The battle was fierce and unforgiving. Amidst the clash of steel and the cries of men, Rhaegar confronted Robert in a duel that would be sung of for generations. Robert was a demon in human form as he smashed his way to the new king. As he was about to defeat the prince, Barristan Selmy and Arthur Dayne intervened, and it took 3 of them together to finally strike a fatal blow to Robert Baratheon. Yet, in his final moments, Robert unleashed a grievous wound upon Rhaegar, a mark that would never leave the new king. With their leader gravely injured, the Targaryen forces could not claim victory. The battle ended in a bloody stalemate, with Rhaegar forced to retreat to King's Landing, his dreams of a united realm slipping through his fingers like sand. The news of the battle's outcome reached Tywin Lannister, who, seeing an opportunity to assert his dominance and perhaps earn the new king's favour, marched his Lannister legions to crush the rebel forces. Thus came the second battle that decided the fate of the realm, the Battle of Riverrun. Tywin had led his army into the Riverlands to finish off what he thought was a weakened rebel army, but he was met by Brandon Stark, who led his forces to a shocking victory over Tywin, a defeat that stunned the realm. With the war mired in a stalemate and the realm bleeding from its many wounds, Rhaegar called for a peace. They met at where it all began, at Harrenhal. It was here in the somber halls that Rhaegar revealed the tragic news: Lyanna Stark had perished, but not before giving birth to a son. The revelation stirred a tumult of emotions among the rebel leaders, but it was Brandon's response that shaped the course of the negotiation. Insisting on the protection of his nephew, he demanded the child be sent to the north with him, a demand to which Rhaegar, seeking peace above all, agreed. The child, named Maekar, would be sent to live with his mother's kin when he was 6 years of age. Another proclamation that further split the realm was Rhaegar claiming that he had married Lyanna and that Maekar was thus legitimate. This caused the Dornish delegation to walk out, and the new king faced heavy criticism from the faith, but the news was welcomed by the rebel camp, though they did not show it outwardly. In a move that shocked his loyalists, Rhaegar granted significant concessions to the north and the Vale. The houses of the Riverlands, though deeply involved in the rebellion, faced no significant retribution. However, the rebels did not leave the council without consequences. Hoster was forced to have his heir given as a hostage to the king. Stannis Baratheon was made the Lord of Storm's End, but the Lord Paramountship was given to House Connington, angering many in the Stormlands. This peace, brokered under the most extraordinary circumstances, paved a path toward a fragile but hopeful future. Thus, the rebellion wound down, not with the roar of dragons, but with the quiet, mournful hope of a realm seeking to mend its deep, festering wounds. Rhaegar was left with a realm that was more fragile than before the dragon's hold on the kingdoms was at its weakest. As the lords left the Council of Peace, many wondered how long the peace would last. Chapter 2, An Uncle's Musings. Brandon Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, stood silently, his gaze fixed on the training yard where his young son and heir, Cregan, learned the sword from his master-at-arms, Sir Roderick. The boy, barely 8, handled his practice sword with an earnestness that filled Brandon's heart with pride. Cregan's arms swung with determination, his small frame maneuvering with agility that belied his youth. Across from him, Sir Roderick, the master-at-arms, watched closely, his experienced eyes catching every slight misstep. "Adjust your footing, lad," Sir Roderick instructed, his voice stern yet encouraging. "Left foot back, not to the side. Remember, balance is key." He demonstrated the position, his own stance wide and stable. Cregan nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration as he mimicked the movement, correcting his posture. Brandon watched the exchange for a while, a smile tugging at his lips as he observed his son's progress. Yet, as the chill of the morning air bit at his skin, he decided it was time to retreat indoors. He was dressed in a finely crafted tunic of deep grey. Over the tunic, he donned a heavy, fur-lined cloak that fell in rich folds to his knees, providing warmth. The cloak was fastened at the throat with a silver clasp shaped like the dire wolf of House Stark, its eyes set with small, smoky quartz stones that caught the light as he moved. Even this was not enough to escape the morning's cold. Turning from the yard, he walked further into the castle, where the coldness of the outside was replaced by a warm atmosphere, a comforting embrace found only within the sturdy walls of Winterfell. This warmth was no mere accident but the result of a clever design, with hot water piped through channels in the stone walls, spreading heat in a silent, steady breath across the halls. As he made his way to his solar, Brandon's thoughts shifted from his son to the duties that awaited him. The room was as he had left it, with a large stack of paper towering on his desk. He paused, correcting himself mentally. No, not parchment, but paper. One of his nephew's many ventures, though paper was already known to many, it was always seen as less durable than parchment. His nephew had found a way to make it stronger and more durable, which was now making its way across the kingdoms, earning significant wealth for their coffers. The thought of his nephew Maekar brought a smile to Brandon's face. Once, the mere sight of the boy had been a painful reminder of Lyanna, his sister, whose spirit seemed to live on in her son. But now, years later, any ache had given way to immense pride and admiration. The boy had grown into a man of formidable intellect and ingenuity, becoming his greatest asset. Sitting down, he began to read through the reports. They showed the profits made in the last 3 months by selling ice to the south and to the free cities. This venture was also one of his nephew's grand ideas. Who would have thought one could make a coin from selling ice? Apparently, his nephew, he thought with a smile. When peace was signed after the rebellion, his greatest demand was for Maekar to be sent to Winterfell, and the rapist king had promised to send him on his 6th name day. Maekar barely made it to the north. Brandon remembered the day he received word that the ship carrying him had sunk. He had flown into a fit of rage, cursing the Southerners for taking the last bit of his sister away. Then, a miracle happened. Maekar was found alive, washed up on a beach near the Manderley lands. The gods had saved him, and it seemed the gods had blessed him as well. At first, he had not taken the boy and his outlandish ideas seriously, but when Luwin had informed him of the value of the paper the boy had managed to make, he decided to hear out more of his ideas. In 5 years, Maekar had helped him increase the wealth of his kingdom threefold, allowing him to finally work on his ambitions of strengthening the north. Ned and his family were already settling well at the stony shore, where he was building a fleet. Finally, the western coast would be free of the pests that were the Ironborn. The moat was being rebuilt, and new farming techniques and trade with Essos had made sure no one in his kingdom would go hungry. He was even confident that they could survive the next winter with fewer lives lost than the last. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Maester Luwin. "My lord, may I come in?" Luwin requested. "Yes, come in, Maester," Brandon said, granting the request. Maester Luwin entered the solar, his robes rustling softly against the stone floor. He was dressed in the traditional attire of a Maester of the Citadel, a long, grey robe bound at the waist with a chain of many metals that clinked with each step, signifying his scholarly achievements. Each link, from Valyrian steel to copper, represented a different field of knowledge he had mastered. "Lord Stark," Luwin began with a respectful nod, "I have the latest reports on the road construction." This was also something he was able to do with the wealth he had amassed in the last 5 years. He was able to fix old roads and build new ones. It was also necessary as trade was increasing between White Harbour and Winterfell. "The road to White Harbour is nearing completion," Luwin continued, his voice holding a note of satisfaction. "However, the road connecting Winterfell with Torrens Square, the Rills, and ultimately to Starkport is progressing slower than anticipated." Starkport was Ned's new fief in the west, where a new fleet would soon be active, 1,000 years after the burner burned the old Stark fleet. Brandon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his interest piqued. "The new roads are made in the Valyrian style that you and Maekar rediscovered. How are they? Are they better?" he asked. Luwin's eyes brightened at the question. "Yes, my lord, they are much better indeed. They have significantly reduced travel times and are less susceptible to damage from weather and wear. It's proving quite effective." A smile spread across Brandon's face, his chest swelling with quiet pride. "That's excellent to hear, Luwin. Things are looking good then," he mused aloud, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction at the progress they were making. His thoughts shifted to what Maekar and Luwin were crafting in their workshop. The workshop, as his nephew called it, was formerly the broken tower which he had torn down and made into a whole new building. Maekar and Luwin had made it their own, and he was not complaining as they showed great results. "What are you and Maekar crafting in the broken tower?" he inquired, his eyes narrowing. Luwin's smile turned secretive, and he adjusted his chain slightly. Prince Maekar asked me to keep it a secret for now. He's preparing for a grand reveal. A secret, then? Very well, I shall wait for this grand reveal, Brandon responded as he bellowed with laughter. I must take my leave now, my lord. There is much to do, Luwin said before bowing and walking out. Alone again, Brandon decided to get some work done. He worked diligently until noon, poring over ledgers and correspondences that required his lordly attention. As the sun reached its peak outside, casting bright light through the narrow windows of his solar, he leaned back in his chair and stretched, feeling the stiffness in his shoulders. He was tired but in good spirits, a rare enough state these days with the myriad responsibilities that weighed upon him. Perhaps a visit to his wife might lighten his mood further, he pondered momentarily. But no, he quickly dismissed the thought, she was still cross with him over some matter or another. The corners of his mouth twitched downwards, a brief shadow of frustration passing over his features. Instead, his mind wandered to lighter, more pleasurable pursuits. A particular memory surfaced, bringing with it a sly smile. Mary, that was her name, the one with the huge tits, he had spent a few enjoyable evenings with last month. Also the reason Cat was angry with me, he thought with a sigh. But it would make the afternoon more fun, his mood lifted at the prospect. Energized by the thought of another rendezvous, he rose from his desk and strode to the door. Before exiting, he caught the attention of one of the guards stationed outside. Tell Maekar to meet me here before supper, he instructed. The guard nodded in acknowledgement and bowed. Brandon left the solar, his step light and expectant as he anticipated the evening's diversion with Mary. Chapter 3, The Ice Dragon PT-1. Maekar was having a good dream, he was surrounded by beautiful women, naked women. He sat on a throne as the women attended to his every need. This was everything he wanted in life made real. A beautiful, buxom blonde approached him, her eyes filled with desire and a devious smile on her lips. She knelt down before him. What do you need, my king? She asked. I think you already know what I want, he replied. She smiled and leaned in, taking his cock into her mouth. And just as the fun began, he woke up. Damn, that was a good dream, he thought, still disoriented from waking. Strange, he thought, feeling the same feeling he was beginning to have in his dream. He lifted his head and looked down to see a beautiful redhead, her voluptuous lips engulfing his cock. He couldn't help but laugh as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. This is a great wake-up call, Ros, he said, his voice laced with pleasure. Ros smiled, taking his cock from her mouth and looking up at him with playful eyes. I believe this is called a Dornish good morning. She purred. Maekar raised an eyebrow. Oh, I've never heard of that one. My madam used to work in Dorne, she said, giving a lick to the underside of his cock, which sent shivers down his spine. He had met Ros last year when he was visiting the brothel in Wintertown, she had become his regular. When he learned she could read and write, he made her an offer she couldn't refuse. What time is it? He asked. Almost evening, she replied. What? Fuck, I'm late, he said, sitting up. Oh, you don't want to finish? She pouted, a look of disappointment crossing her features. We can finish this tonight. Meet me in the workshop, and have the workers bring the machines to the central chamber. I will be showing them to my uncle today, he said, getting dressed. Ros slid off the bed gracefully, quickly adjusting her dress to cover herself appropriately. She smoothed the fabric with her hands, ensuring everything looked orderly, and glanced at Maekar with a slightly amused expression. One of the guards told me earlier that your uncle was looking for you, she said, tying back a stray lock of hair that had fallen loose during their earlier activity. He asked for you to meet him at his solar before supper. He paused in the midst of lacing up his boots, his brow furrowing slightly at the information. Great, he replied. I'll bring him to the workshop after. With a confident stride, he walked out of the chamber thinking of a lie to tell his aunt why he was so late to wake. I think it's best I avoid her today, especially with her angry at Uncle Brandon, he thought. As he meandered through the corridors of the castle, he spotted a servant girl approaching with a tray full of steamed buns. The dish had become a favorite in Winterfell and other castles in the north after he had told the head cook how to make it. Curious and a bit peckish, he intercepted the girl. Who are these for? He inquired, nodding towards the tray. They're for the steward, Prince, the servant girl replied, adjusting her hold on the tray to keep it steady. His grin turned mischievous. Well, He won't miss one, he declared, swiftly swiping a bun from the tray. Before the servant could protest, he was already striding away from her, leaving a trail of amused looks from the people around him. Savoring the warm, soft bun as he walked, he made his way toward the workshop. It stood where the broken tower once had. The tower was demolished under his uncle's orders and rebuilt into something far grander and more practical. It had become a mini citadel of sorts, bustling with workers and acolytes Lewin had taken under his wing. The building had been finished only a few months ago and was still being furnished. For the last month, they had been assembling machines that would create a whole new industry here in the north. He entered the workshop to see Maester Lewin inspecting a large framed object in his hands. "What's that you've got there?" he inquired, his curiosity piqued as he approached. "It is a gift to Lord Stark from the merchant who oversees our ice trade in King's Landing," Lewin explained, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "So why is it here and not with my uncle?" he asked in confusion. Lewin turned the frame around for him to see, revealing a meticulously detailed painting of the Red Keep. Maekar's eyes widened in understanding as he looked at the painting. "I thought it wise to intercept this before it reached your uncle," he confessed, setting the painting on a nearby table carefully. "Given his feelings towards your father's family." Maekar laughed, a rich, hearty laugh that echoed slightly in the vast room. "Either the merchant is an idiot, or he has a good sense of humor. It's good that you took it. Uncle would probably have thrown it into the fire without a second glance." As Lewin gently set the painting down, Maekar found his gaze lingering on the image of the Red Keep. A rush of memories, not entirely his own, surged through his mind. It was always a surreal experience, recalling the snippets of life from the 6-year-old Maekar Targaryen, the original soul of the body he now inhabited. 10 years had passed since he woke up on a beach, disoriented and alone, found by men loyal to House Manderley. Adjusting to his new reality was challenging, but he was able to do it after some time. His uncles Brandon Eddard and Benyon had welcomed with open arms. Even Aunt Ashura Eddard's wife showed no coldness towards him, considering she was once the Queen's handmaiden and still continued to be friends. He had the memories of the 6-year-old Maekar who had died at sea, memories of a lonely boy who wondered why his father did not like him. From what he tried to understand from these memories at the Red Keep, Maekar was shunned at court, and Rhaegar, whether due to not caring or guilt over his actions with his mother, seldom visited the boy. The last memories of little Maekar were the most painful: the ship attack, the cold, dark waters engulfing him as he drowned. The boy had died afraid and alone, and these moments were the hardest for him to relieve. Sometimes he wished he could shed these memories, but a part of him wanted to find the people who had plotted the death of a child. Not now, he thought. He needed to gain more power after adjusting to his life in this new body as Maekar Targaryen. He had promised himself something, he had been given an opportunity to live in this new fantasy realm. Why not live it to the fullest? Why not enjoy the pleasures of life? Why not rise to the very top? Even in his previous life, he was a very ambitious man, and that drive had never faded away. He wished to climb to the very top of the ladder, and here, at the very top, was the Iron Throne. And he was only third in line to the throne, well, fifth if he included his sister and uncle. He was still considered a bastard by some in the south. He started this climb by helping his uncle. He had suggested selling ice to the south and the free cities. At first, his uncle laughed it off, but with the support of Maester Lewin, he showed his uncle how ice could be insulated using sawdust and straw. He explained to him how they could cut large chunks of ice from beyond the wall or from frozen lakes in the north itself, and transport them by sea to the free cities and the cities in the south. It would only partially melt, and there would be plenty left, which could be stored in ice houses that they would build in the city and be sold. They tried it first with Bravus, and seeing the increase in popularity and the coin made from the first few months of trade, his uncle threw his full support behind him. They partnered with various merchants, influential figures, and lords across cities on the coast of the Narrow Sea. These partnerships were crucial, as they provided the local knowledge and infrastructure necessary to establish and maintain the ice houses. It had become a luxury product in the south and the free cities, and his uncle and the lords of the north now held a monopoly on this trade. He was not done yet. After the success of the ice trade and seeing how expensive parchment was, he decided to introduce more durable paper here. Leveraging the abundant timber resources of the north, his venture into papermaking had started as a modest endeavor which he thought would take some time to get going, but it quickly caught the attention of customers far and wide. The free cities, with their vast networks of scholars, traders, and bureaucrats, emerged as the primary customers, drawn by the cost-effectiveness and quality of the paper compared to traditional parchment. It got so popular that they could not keep up with the demand, so he had to think of a way to increase the production. This led to him deciding to harness the power of water. The north had many rivers and streams. Uncle Brandon with his urging decided to create a village near Winterfell where a branch of the White Knife flowed. There, he and Luwin created water mills to harness the power of running water. This helped in mechanizing the process of pulping and automating the pressing of pulp into sheets of paper. With the success of the first water mill, they made multiple water mills, and soon the village grew into a small town, which his uncle named Maekar in his honor. His uncle had also granted permission for other lords to do the same, provided they pay a special tax to him yearly which he also charged for the ice trade. The water mills were also being adapted to other sectors, especially in agriculture. With Uncle Brandon crediting his success to him, he was well known and respected in the north. Even though he held the name Targaryen, his fame was also increasing in the south, according to his burgeoning network of spies which ROS had been helping him build. The primary source of this network were whores who worked in brothels, a tactic he had taken from the playbook of Littlefinger himself. He was broken from his thoughts as he watched the workers brought out the machines he and Luwin had been working on for over a year, something that was going to make the north a fortune and kickstart a new industry. ROS. This is part 1 of this chapter. A lot of exposition to set up the MC and what happened in the 10 years he has been here. If there is any confusion regarding the part where he talks about 6-year-old Maekar's memories, here is how the MC arrived in this world. 6-year-old Maekar Targaryen is sent to the north according to the deal struck by Brandon and Rhaegar. His ship is attacked and he drowns. The MC wakes up in Maekar's body washed up on a beach and found by Manderley men. The MC has memories of Maekar and his time in the Red Keep and that he drowned, so he knows someone is out to get him. Chapter 4, The Ice Dragon PT2. Maekar made his way to his uncle's solar. He spent most of his time in the workshop these days, as his best friend and cousin had left with Uncle Ned when the castle at Starkport was completed. He missed Robb. They used to get up to all sorts of trouble. Uncle Brandon had his own children, but Cregan and Sara were just kids, and Sansa and him did not have much in common. He stepped into his uncle's solar, the door creaking softly behind him as the guard closed it. He was immediately greeted by the sight of Brandon Stark, his uncle, lounging comfortably in his chair with a relaxed smile, his eyes fixed on the elaborately carved wooden beams of the ceiling. At the sound of him entering, Brandon's head tilted downwards, his gaze shifting to his nephew. Maekar. Right on time, he bellowed. Uncle, he replied, giving a respectful nod as he took a seat in one of the plush chairs opposite Brandon. Brandon stood, moving to pour himself a drink. The rich red liquid glinted in the light as it sloshed into the cup. Care for one? He asked, holding up the bottle as an offer. He shook his head gently. No, thank you, he replied, his mind already on the matters they needed to discuss. Returning to his seat, Brandon took a sip of his wine before diving straight into business. The Valyrian roads between Winterfell, Meekarton, and the King's Road are all nearly complete, he announced with a note of satisfaction in his voice. Ah, the Valyrian roads, they were just Roman roads that he had rebranded and introduced to his uncle and Luwin. That's great. The merchants will be pleased, Maekar responded, thinking about how these roads would improve trade and travel, bolstering the economy and the daily lives of the North's inhabitants. Ah, fuck them. Always complaining, Brandon muttered, taking another sip of his wine. His tone, though gruff, carried a hint of humor. It was no secret that Brandon found the constant grievances of merchants a tiresome aspect of his duties, but he understood their importance to the North's prosperity. Maekar smiled slightly, accustomed to his uncle's candid outbursts. They might complain, uncle, but their carts will roll smoother and their goods will move faster on these roads. It's a boon for all, even if they don't always acknowledge it. Brandon chuckled, setting his cup down. True enough. And what is this secret project I keep hearing about? He asked. I plan to show it to you after supper, he replied. Oh, finished, have you? Well, let's see it then, Brandon said, standing up. After supper, uncle, he said, stopping Brandon. Fine, the Lord of Winterfell replied. But that is not what I called you here today. It's about the roads, nephew. I don't like that it's called Valyrian roads, we should change it. It doesn't suit the North. Ha, I knew this was coming, Maekar thought to himself, barely suppressing a laugh. Any ideas, uncle? He asked. Brandon stayed silent for a while before announcing, Stark Roads. Of course, he would want to name it that. Surprised he didn't name it Wolf Road or something, he thought. So, what do you think? Great name, yes. Brandon said. You are the Lord of Winterfell, uncle. You can do as you please, Maekar responded, managing to keep his amusement in check. Yes, Stark Roads it is, Brandon confirmed, settling the matter with a decisive air. Can we go then? Maekar asked. Yes, but one more thing, Brandon said, his demeanor quickly shifting to a more serious tone. The girl you've been with has to go. Kat has been complaining, he said sternly. Maekar's mind raced. Was he talking about ROS? ROS, are you talking about ROS? He clarified. Yes, Brandon confirmed bluntly. What? No, Maekar protested. She is a whore, nephew. If you like her so much, then bring her in the cover of night. She can't stay here, Brandon advised, his tone brooking no argument. Uncle, she's a valuable helper, Maekar tried to defend ROS. Yes, for your cock, Brandon retorted sharply, cutting through his defense. He remained silent for a moment, then smiled. Here's the thing, uncle, you get to let me keep ROS around. Maekar, I told you. Brandon began to say. I'm not done yet, he said, interrupting his uncle. I get to keep ROS around, and I won't tell Aunt Cat that you were with that Mary again, he bargained, revealing his knowledge of his uncle's own indiscretions. Brandon was visibly shocked. How do you know that? He demanded, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. I know, uncle, Maekar replied simply, his smile saying more than words could. Brandon cursed under his breath, clearly cornered by his nephew. Fine, you can keep her here, he conceded reluctantly, knowing he was outplayed. Well, since that is out of the way, let's have supper and then go to the workshop, he said before walking out of the room. Brandon watched his nephew leave with a smile, thinking of ways to get his wife to accept the girl's presence here. They made their way to the chamber the family used for private dinners. The family was already gathered there. Sansa's face lit up as she saw them, Cregan looked up with a respectful nod, and Catelyn, holding little Sarah in her arms, offered a warm but somewhat reserved smile. Father, Maekar! Sansa exclaimed, jumping up from her seat. Maekar grinned at her enthusiasm. Sansa, the silk you wanted will arrive tomorrow, he announced, knowing how much she was looking forward to the new materials for her sewing projects. Sansa clapped her hands in delight. Oh, thank you, Maekar. That is wonderful news. Turning to Cregan, he adopted a teasing tone. And how did your training go today? Think you can beat me now? He asked playfully. Cregan, ever serious, nodded firmly. Yes, I will be the best in the whole of the Seven Kingdoms, he declared with youthful confidence. Catelyn, overhearing their conversation, interjected with a pointed look at Maekar. And where were you this morning, Maekar? She asked, her tone carrying a hint of accusation. Maekar met her gaze squarely, deciding honesty was the best approach. I was up all night, so I slept in, he confessed openly. Catelyn's expression tightened slightly as she muttered under her breath, probably with that whore. As they began to eat, the tension at the table was palpable. Looks like Aunt Cat and Uncle have not made up, he thought. No wonder she has been in a bad mood and targeted ROS, usually, she wasn't this strict and was always nice to him. After a few moments, Catelyn turned to Brandon. Did you have that talk you were supposed to? She pressed, her eyes searching. He exchanged a quick glance with his uncle, a silent reminder of the agreement they had just struck. Brandon cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. We can talk about that later, Cat, he said calmly. Catelyn, not easily dissuaded, pressed on. But later, Cat, Brandon repeated, his voice firmer this time, signaling an end to the discussion. And where were you all afternoon, my lord? She asked. Brandon looked like he was searching for an answer. He was with me, Aunt Cat, he replied quickly, saving the poor man. Oh, was he? She turned to him with narrowed eyes. Yes, yes he was, he answered. He saw his uncle sending him a silent thank you. He was pretty sure there wouldn't be any complaints about ROS from now on. As supper concluded and the family began to disperse, Brandon leaned in towards Maekar. Let's head to the workshop now, he suggested quietly. Maekar nodded, relieved to leave the chamber. He hoped that his uncle and aunt would make up quickly, it was getting awkward to be around them. They arrived at the workshop to see Lewin waiting. Maekar could also see Ros busily dusting off one of the machines. As she caught sight of them, she quickly excused herself and left the room. "I can see why you keep her around," Brandon said, hitting his nephew in the stomach playfully. He brushed off his uncle's juvenile comment and led him into the room. "These are what we have been working on," Maekar began, gesturing towards the two prominent machines in the center of the room. Brandon approached, his interest evident as he examined each device with a critical eye. "Uncle, remember how years ago you increased the wool production in the north to make more coin?" he asked. Brandon nodded, prompting Maekar to continue. "What if we could do more with the wool other than just sell it outright?" Brandon's curiosity was piqued. "Go on," he urged. He walked over to the first machine, a robust, intricate device with wheels and gears. "This is the spinning mule," he introduced, patting the sturdy frame of the machine. "It's designed to transform wool into yarn much more efficiently than traditional spinning methods. It can draw out the wool fibers and twist them into yarn in one continuous process. This not only speeds up production but also produces stronger woolen yarn." Brandon watched intently, visibly impressed by the demonstration. He then led his uncle over to the second prominent machine in the workshop, its structure more complex and imposing than the first. "This," he said with a note of pride, "is the power loom. The power loom automates the weaving process, converting the woolen yarn we produce with the spinning mule into cloth. It's much faster than traditional hand weaving and requires fewer people to operate, which drastically cuts down on labor costs and time. As long as we have a steady supply of yarn, this machine can mass-produce cloth. It's not just limited to wool, we can change some parts, and it can also make other types of cloth. For instance, if we start growing flax, we could use these looms to make linen. We can sell linen to the free cities, especially those with hot climates." Brandon watched the power loom at work, its rhythmic, mechanical weaving almost hypnotic. He laughed, a sound of genuine delight and admiration, and then enveloped Maekar in a hearty hug. "You have done well, my boy," he exclaimed, his voice filled with warmth and pride. Turning to Lewin, Brandon extended the same affectionate gesture. "And you, Maester, your guidance has been invaluable," he said. Lewin, however, humbly redirected the praise back to Maekar. "It was all Maekar," he insisted, a gentle smile on his face. "I simply assisted him. Uncle, I would like to go to Maekar so I can make sure the machines are properly installed and the workers are trained on how to use them effectively," Maekar continued. "We also need to increase wool production more," Lewin chimed in. Brandon was silent for a while. After a while, he broke his silence. "It seems there is a lot to then. Maekar, I cannot let you go to Maekar yet, Lewin can go in your stead. I need your help with something else," he said. "What is it, uncle?" he asked. Brandon raised his hands and turned to Lewin. "Maester, you will have all the resources to go to Maekar with these machines and train the people to use them. I will provide you with an adequate supply of wool. How long will it take? As we already have workers who know how to use them, training others will take some months. If you can provide me with some experienced seamstresses, then that will make things easier," Lewin replied. "You will have all you want," Brandon said and turned to Maekar. "Maekar, I need you to go to Bear Island. Ned is tied up in Stark Port, and Benyon is in the Free Cities handling our trade negotiations. I need someone with Stark blood to go in my stead." "What's happening on Bear Island?" he asked. "There have been increasing reports of wildling attacks," Brandon explained, his voice carrying a hint of concern. "The Mormonts have been holding their own, but the attacks are becoming more frequent and more bold. I need you to go there and assess the situation so I can prepare an appropriate response." Maekar nodded. "Yes, uncle. Meet me in my solar tomorrow. We can discuss the details then," he said before walking out. "Well, Lewin, it looks like I'm off to Bear Island," he said, watching his uncle leave. "Be careful, my prince," Lewin responded. "Lewin, when have I ever not been careful?" he said with a smile. He returned to his room, deep in thought about his impending journey to Bear Island. As he entered, he saw her standing in the center of the room with a mischievous smirk. She shrugged off her clothes, revealing her naked form. "You have a promise to fulfill," she said, walking closer to him. He walked over to her. With a sudden move, he lifted her up effortlessly. Ros let out a surprised yelp as he carried her across the room and gently tossed her onto the bed. Looks like I won't be getting much sleep tonight as well, he thought as their lips met. Chapter 5, On the Road. Maekar rode into Maekardon on his destrier named Red. Horse riding was not something he had done in his previous life, but here it came to him naturally. His uncles would tell him it was something he inherited from his mother Lyanna. As he took in the sights of the town, a sense of pride and fulfillment filled him. Since his last visit, Maekardon had transformed significantly, blossoming under his careful planning and vision. Behind him, a retinue of guards assigned to him by his uncle as his escort followed closely, with Luwin and Ros among them. The layout of Maekardon was meticulously planned. The town was divided into 3 districts, the residential area where workers and their families lived. Homes were built with sturdy, locally sourced materials, designed to withstand the harsh northern climate. These neighborhoods were organized in neat rows and provided a high quality of life for the people. The industrial area was near the river to utilize its power, so the paper mills could process large amounts of timber into paper. The finished product was then taken by the river in barges to White Harbor, from there shipped to the Free Cities and to the south. It was also the place where the new textile factories would be constructed. The final district was the commercial and administrative areas. It was centrally located, allowing easy access for residents and visitors. This area featured shops, markets, brothels, and taverns, catering to the daily needs and leisure activities of the town's population. Nearby, the administrative buildings stood, housing the offices responsible for managing Maekardon's growth and operations. He reached the center of the town in front of the mayor's office. Mayor was a title he asked his uncle to create. It was given to a man named Bjorn, who was already a community leader among the local villages in the area before they were combined into the town. It seemed the entire town was gathered here to see him. As he got off his horse, they bowed deeply to him. "Please, everyone, rise," he urged with a warm smile, gesturing to the townspeople to stand. Bjorn approached him. He was a robust man with a commanding presence. Prince, all's set for you," he said, his voice carrying over the gathering. "The new mansa's near done. Ain't all furnished yet, but it's right livable if you choose to stay." He had ordered a mansion built a little distance away from the town for his use and for his family from Winterfell to use if they traveled here, but he would not be able to use the mansion now as he was going to leave immediately. "Bjorn, I am sorry, but I will not be staying," he responded, his announcement sparking a flurry of murmurs and expressions of concern among the gathered crowd. Prince, I thought," Bjorn began, a hint of confusion and disappointment in his voice. I know, Maekar quickly interjected, raising his hand to quell the rising chatter. "But my uncle has tasked me with traveling to Bear Island to address the issue of wildlings attacking the area." This revelation stirred the crowd even more, their murmurs turning into expressions of admiration and respect. "Very brave. A prince of the people. The prince is a true ruler." He basked in the praise and respect of the small folk. "Then I wish you a safe journey, Prince," Bjorn said, his voice carrying sincere hope for Maekar's well-being. Maekar then gestured towards Luwin and Ros, who were standing behind him. "They will stay here, helping with the new machinery that will arrive soon. Help them in all matters," he commanded Bjorn, ensuring that his absence wouldn't hinder the progress they were making. Bjorn bowed deeply, his voice steady. "Yes, Prince. I'll serve just as I serve you." "Good," he acknowledged with a nod, satisfied with Bjorn's pledge of support. Turning, he climbed back onto his horse, ready to depart. Looking over to Luwin and Ros, he gave them a reassuring smile. "See you in a few months." Luwin gave him a nod and Ros blew him a kiss. With his escort assembled and ready, he rode out of Maekardon. They had been traveling for a week now, traversing the dense, shadowy expanse of the Wolf's Wood. He loved the beauty of the north. He had traveled all over as his uncle took him along whenever he traveled to see the other lords. The only place he had not been to was the Wall, something he hoped he would see during this trip, as wildlings were involved. They were a day from Deepwood Mot. From there, they would travel by sea to Bear Island. One of the scouts, riding at the forefront of the group, abruptly halted, causing the entire procession to come to a standstill. "What is it, Will?" Maekar called out, his voice steady despite the hint of concern. "There's movement in the woods, Prince," Will replied, pointing toward an elevated position where the underbrush rustled suspiciously. Just then, another guard from his side shouted, his voice carrying a clear note of alarm, "Wildlings!" Instantly, the calm of the forest was shattered as everyone unsheathed their swords. Maekar, more comfortable with his weapon of choice, took up his trusty spear. Wildlings burst from the cover of trees, 20 ragged, fierce figures charging, screaming like savages with their crude weapons drawn. They descended upon them with reckless abandon. He spurred his horse forward to meet the onslaught. His training and instincts took over as he maneuvered his steed, the spear in his hand a deadly extension of his will. He thrust and parried, his movements fluid and precise, each jab of his spear fending off or downing an attacker. Around him, his guards engaged the wildlings, their swords flashing in the muted light that filtered through the dense canopy. Despite their numbers, the wildlings were undisciplined, their attacks more fervent than strategic. Maekar and his retinue moved with lethal efficiency that gradually turned the tide in their favor. He thrust the spear into one of the wildlings' chests but was attacked by another wildling from his side, which caught his horse off balance, sending both him and Red tumbling to the forest floor. Scrambling to his feet, spear still in hand, he faced his assailant. The wildling, large and looming, wielded a crude axe, swinging it with wild, powerful arcs. "Come meet your end, boy!" the large man screamed, slashing at him. Maekar dodged a particularly vicious swing, feeling the whoosh of air as the blade sliced near his face. He adopted a defensive stance. He parried the next few attacks with the shaft of his spear, each block forcing the wildling back. Finding an opening, he thrust forward, his spear finding its mark. The wildling grunted, stumbled, and fell, defeated. Breathing heavily, he surveyed the scene. The forest floor was littered with bodies, they had killed them all. His heart still pounding from the adrenaline, he wiped his brow and looked around at his men. "Anyone hurt?" he called out. Harold, the man who led his escort, approached him. "Everyone's alive, but Will is hurt bad," he said, panting. "Help him any way you can and make him ready for travel. We ride hard to Deepwood Mot, the Glovers will help with Will's injuries," he ordered. Harold bowed and left to Will's side. Wildlings this deep into the north, he thought. They were only supposed to be in Bear Island. Something was wrong, and he would need to get to the bottom of this. The Glovers will have answers, he thought as he approached Red. The horse was still alive, much to his relief. "Thank the gods you are safe, boy," he said, petting the horse. "Come on, boy. It seems we have a mystery on our hands here," he said, leading Red toward the others who were gathered near Will. Chapter 6, Deepwood Mot. Maekar and his escort rode hard towards Deepwood Mot. Their skirmish with the wildlings had left Will, one of the guards, in bad shape. His condition was stabilizing but still severe. The encounter with the wildlings here was unusual. Typically, small bands of wildlings might be spotted near the Gift, where the Umbers made sure they didn't venture further south. However, encountering a group as large as 20 this far into the north was deeply unsettling. The possibility that this was not an isolated incident gnawed at him. His mind analyzed potential scenarios. Perhaps Mance Rayder had organized an army, but he quickly ruled that possibility out as the Night's Watch was at its strongest since the conquest. There was one thing his uncle begrudgingly respected his father for, and that was his constant support for the Wall. Then how did a band of wildlings this large get past the Watch when it was at its strongest in years? He was left with more questions than answers. Deepwood Mot was soon in sight. It was situated on a rounded hill with a flattened top, giving it a strategic vantage point over the surrounding area, though the fortifications themselves were not particularly strong. The castle was more functional than imposing, constructed primarily of wood from the abundant forests that gave the region its name. The approach to Deepwood Mot was scenic, with fields of oats and barley stretching around the hill, waving gently in the breeze. These fields provided the granary needed to sustain the garrison and the small population that lived within the Mot's modest walls. The structure itself was surrounded by a wooden palisade, offering basic protection. Inside, the buildings were similarly constructed with wood, practical and sturdy against the elements but lacking the grandeur of more southern and some northern fortresses. As he rode up to the gate, he could see signs of battle. The guards seemed alert, but they quickly recognized our banners and allowed us entry. The guards with him quickly got Will off his horse. He looked at the entrance of the castle to see Galbart, head of House Glover, walking towards him. "Master Glover, it looks like you've had some problems." Maekar opened the conversation, acknowledging the tension that seemed to pervade the wooden castle. "It seems you have had some as well, my prince," Galbart replied, his gaze drifting to the guard being helped towards the maester's quarters. "Wildlings," Maekar stated simply. Galbart's face contorted with a mixture of rage and frustration. he confirmed grimly. We were attacked at night. 5 dead, and Ethan. His voice trailed off. Maekar knew Ethan Glover, he was his uncle's squire and had been left at King's Landing for the first few years for his protection. He only had fond memories of the man, and the saddest day in his life before coming to the north was when Ethan left King's Landing. Ethan, what happened? He asked, panic rising. Ethan was injured, he lost one of his arms. One of the savages cut it off, Galbart said with barely controlled rage. Fucking wildlings, Maekar cursed under his breath, his frustration echoing Galbart's. I was about to send word to Winterfell, but it seems our lord has thought ahead, Galbart said with a smile. Uncle Brandon heard of the wildling attacks at Bear Island, and I was sent to assess the situation, but this is far worse. Only the gods know how the savages slipped past the watch, Galbart said, leading him inside. Perhaps by sea, Maekar mused aloud. Considering they reached Bear Island first, that could be a possibility, Galbart replied. Galbart, I'll need to speed up my journey to Bear Island, Maekar said decisively. But first, we need to inform Winterfell of this development. I'll ready our fastest ship for your journey, my prince, Galbart responded. Will receive the necessary medical attention and would recover. He would be left here as he was in no state to travel. Maekar visited the maester's chamber and wrote a message to his uncle, detailing the attack on him and the presence of bands of wildlings in the Wolfwoods. He emphasized the urgency of the situation. Handing the scroll to the maester, he watched as it was quickly tied to a raven and sent off toward Winterfell. The blackbird took flight, disappearing into the grey sky. Through the window, he could see Galbart's brother Robert drilling soldiers, they were going to search and hunt down more wildlings. He then decided to visit Ethan. As he walked through the wooden corridors of the castle, he was shown into a dimly lit room where Ethan was resting. His face was pale, and there was a stump where his left arm used to be. Noticing that Ethan was asleep, possibly aided by milk of the poppy for his pain, he chose not to disturb him. Instead, he stood quietly at the bedside for a moment. He left after a while and went straight to the yard. Bear Island would be more dangerous than here, he hoped Daisy and her sisters were fine. He had grown close to her during the times she visited Winterfell and had become close, very close. Up for a spar, Robert? He asked, spear in hand as he approached Galbart's brother. Robert grinned, taking his sword. I heard you were good with that spear. Come find out then, Maekar said, pointing his spear at Robert. By the afternoon, Galbart had readied the fastest ship he had for Maekar's journey to Bear Island. Maekar and his escort of guards, all in full gear, made their way to the harbour. Master Glover, I hope you clear out those savages. I'll try to find the root of the problem, Maekar said, standing at the docks. We'll get those fuckers, my prince, Galbart replied, to the cheers of his men behind him. He nodded and proceeded to board the ship. Soon, the ship cast off, the crew unfurled the sails, and the coast of Deepwood Mot began to recede from view. He stood at the stern, watching the land disappear. As they traversed the tumultuous waters of the Bay of Ice, the night air grew bitingly cold. Wrapped tightly in his cloak, Maekar stood on deck, regretting his decision to travel through the night. The cold seeped into his bones, but the sight above offered a breathtaking distraction. The clear, dark sky was alive with the shimmering colors of the northern lights. The sea around them was rough, tossing the ship with waves that seemed intent on challenging the vessel's integrity. However, the men aboard were seasoned sailors, so he was in safe hands. His gaze remained fixed on the northern lights, their brilliant hues casting ghostly reflections on the churning waters below. It was a rare kind of beauty that only a few in this world have experienced. He went to sit near a lamp, absorbing its modest warmth as he stared at the sky. His thoughts wandered to his future. He knew his uncle was planning to have him married to a northern lady and have him settled in Meekarton. It was a safe and respectable path. Yet, as comforting as that vision might be, he harbored grander ambitions that stretched beyond the borders of the north and into the very heart of the Seven Kingdoms. His name and fame were already trickling through into the south, and he knew soon enough his father would call him back to the capital or one of his enemies would have his father do it. They did try to kill him 10 years ago, perhaps they would think it easier to try the deed again in King's Landing. It was only a matter of when the Raven would come with orders for his uncle to send him back, and he was ready. The capital wouldn't know what hit them. His thoughts were interrupted when one of the sailors shouted, "Land!" The sky was brightening with the first signs of dawn. He stood up, shaking off the remnants of the night's cold, and stepped towards the railing. His gaze fell upon the approaching rocky landscape. This will be fun, he thought as the land became clearer and the sun rose over the horizon. Chapter 7, Meeting the Bears. The ship sailed hugging the coast of Bear Island, as all ships did in this world. They always hugged the coast, and if they couldn't, they hoped the stars would guide them. Once, he wanted to make a compass to help the sailors. He was even close to making a printing press, but after some thinking, he decided against it. He planned to rule the 7 kingdoms in the future, and an invention like the printing press would have unintended consequences, especially for the noble class. And a compass, well, he imagined some Ironborn getting their hands on it. He still wanted to introduce the compass, but only when he had the means to control the Ironborn. His thoughts drifted to the Mormonts, especially Daisy. They had become fast friends when she and her family visited Winterfell last year. They had found common ground in their love for hunting and sparring. Daisy was the epitome of a northern woman, fierce, independent, and unapologetically bold. She possessed fair skin that contrasted sharply with her jet black hair, which fell around her shoulders in a wild, untamed mane. Her body was both muscular and slim. Her eyes, striking and expressive, seemed to challenge and invite all at once. Also, she had very nice tits. They had sparred, ridden, and hunted together. She had even promised to take him hunting on Bear Island whenever he visited. Daisy was straightforward with him when she confessed her attraction to him. She knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to pursue it, a quality he found very attractive. After that, they spent the rest of her stay in Winterfell having secret rendezvous all over the castle. They were even almost caught one time. He shook off the memories of their trysts. Trying to take his mind off it, he took the far-eye he had brought with him, one of his prized possessions. He looked through it, surveying the rugged landscape dotted with large pine trees and craggy rocks. Nothing seemed particularly out of the ordinary at first. However, as he continued scanning, a sudden movement caught his eye. A small group of figures moved swiftly towards the cover of the trees. He counted 6, possibly 9 wildlings, their movements furtive and purposeful as they disappeared into the thick greenery. A cold knot of worry formed in his stomach. Seeing wildlings this bold and this close to Mormont Keep was alarming. Switching his view, he moved the far eye to the right and spotted a small fishing village along the shoreline. Fuck, he muttered, the far eye still pressed to his eye as he tracked any further movement. It became clear that the wildlings were heading towards the village, likely planning an attack. Captain, change course to the fishing village. Now, he called out to the captain. The captain hesitated, shouting back, we can't dock there, Prince. The waters are too shallow and rocky. Then get us as close as you can. He yelled, frustration edging his voice. The captain cursed under his breath but nodded, giving the orders to adjust their course. As the ship began to turn towards the village, Maekar ordered his men to arm themselves. He looked through the far eye again and saw the wildlings getting closer to the village, their intent clear. The ship, though unable to dock directly, maneuvered as close to the shore as possible. The crew worked quickly, lowering small boats into the water to ferry the armed men to land. Arm yourselves! Maekar commanded, his voice carrying across the deck. We need to be ready the moment we hit the shore. They boarded the small boats and began to row towards the shore. As they got closer to the shore, his heart sank as he heard screams from the village. He could wait no longer. With a determined roar, he leaped into the shallow water, his men following after him. They charged towards the village, the icy water splashing around their legs. They had caught the wildlings off guard, the shock in their eyes was evident as they saw the armed men emerging from the sea. For Winterfell! Maekar screamed, his spear held in an attack position. His battle cry was echoed by his men. For Winterfell! They roared. The clash was immediate and brutal. Maekar thrust his spear into the first wildling he encountered, the point driving through the man's chest with a sickening crunch. He pulled the spear free and spun towards another wildling who was charging at him, swinging a crude axe. He ducked under the swing and drove his spear into the wildling's side, the force of the blow knocking the man to the ground. Around him, his men fought valiantly, their swords flashing in the morning light as they cut through the attackers. The wildlings, though fierce, were no match for the well-trained warriors of Winterfell. He looked for his next opponent, only to be lunged at by a burly wildling. He sidestepped the attack, his spear finding its mark once again. He stopped to take a breath, his gaze turning to a nearby hut where a terrified child stood, a wildling looming over her with a raised weapon. No! He bellowed, charging forward with a burst of speed fueled by desperation. Realizing that he wouldn't reach the wildling in time, he made a split-second decision. With a powerful, practiced motion, he threw his spear. The weapon sailed through the air with deadly precision, striking the wildling in the back. The wildling dropped his weapon and fell to the ground, dead. His men had killed the last of the wildlings. He looked to see two trying to escape, but before he could give the order to pursue, the sound of thundering hooves filled the air. A group of 10 horsemen in Mormont colors surged forward, cutting down the retreating wildlings with swift, decisive strikes. Maekar knew immediately who was leading the charge. The survivors of the village celebrated, some crying out in relief and others mourning their fallen family and friends. He saw the leader of the horsemen riding toward him. "You're late, Daisy," he called out, a hint of teasing in his voice. Daisy Mormont removed her helm, letting her dark hair fall free. "I think I was just in time," she replied with a confident smile, her eyes meeting his. Daisy dismounted and approached him. "We have been tracking them for a day. Glad you were here, otherwise. It's done. The village is saved," he said. "Still," she said, looking at a woman crying over her fallen husband. "We can't save everyone, Daisy," he said. Daisy turned to him, her expression softening. "It's good to see you, Maekar." "Good to see you as well, Daisy." Daisy arranged for Maekar and his men to be provided with horses, as she was leaving some of her own men to help fortify and secure the village. Once mounted, they began their ride towards Mormont Keep. As they rode, he turned to Daisy. "Tell me about these wildling attacks. How long have they been happening?" he asked over the sounds of hoofbeats. Daisy's expression grew serious. "They began last month. At first, we thought it was just the usual. We get 1 or 2 small bands every 2 months or so, but now they keep coming. We don't know how they're managing to get this far." Maekar frowned, his mind racing with possibilities. "Have you found any boats? If the wildlings got their hands on a ship?" Daisy shook her head. "No, we haven't found any. But we suspect someone might be ferrying them here." His thoughts churned as he considered the implications. Who would ferry wildlings past the wall, and for what reason? The question gnawed at him, the mystery deepening with every passing moment. They rode in silence for a while, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on them. The path they traveled wound through dense pine forests, the towering trees forming a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the ground still wet from recent rains. The occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush and the distant call of birds added a sense of life to the serene yet imposing surroundings. After some time, he decided to lighten the mood. "You promised to take me on a hunt, she-bear. I'm here now, so when will we go?" Daisy smiled slyly. "Oh, I have many things planned, Maekar. In fact, I'm planning something right now." He chuckled. "Oh, then I look forward to it," he said. Mormont Keep came into view after 2 hours of hard riding. Along the way, he and Daisy caught up, sometimes exchanging flirtatious banter and playful barbs. Mormont Keep was a wood-walled castle built of huge logs. An earthen palisade encircled the hall, adding a layer of defense to the fortress. On the gate, there was a striking carving of a woman in a bearskin, a babe suckling at her breast in one arm and a battle-axe in the other, a powerful symbol of House Mormont's strength and resilience. Riding through the gates, he saw Jeor Mormont, the old bear, and his son and heir, Yora, drilling men in the yard. Jeor spotted him and broke into a wide smile. "Welcome, Prince of Winterfell." Jeor called out, his booming voice echoing across the yard. Maekar smiled back. "That title hasn't been used in 3 centuries, Lord Mormont," he replied with a grin as he dismounted. "Well, you are a prince, aren't you? One with Stark blood, so I think it's fitting," Jeor said, his tone both jovial and sincere. Maekar approached the large man and embraced him warmly. He had always liked Jeor, who had been nothing but kind to him during his visits to Winterfell. As they broke the hug, he saw Yora walking towards him, long claw in hand. "Prince Maekar," Yora said, bowing his head respectfully. "Yora," Maekar replied, acknowledging him with a nod. "So I hear you have a wildling problem." "A problem?" Jeor interjected with a bark of laughter. "It's an invasion," he bellowed. Jeor then turned serious. "We can talk more inside," he said, gesturing towards the keep. Maekar gave Yora a nod before following Gior into the hall. Inside, the atmosphere was warmer, the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat mingling in the air. Gior was not one to exaggerate, and if he called it an invasion, it was a matter of dire importance. Once inside the main hall, Gior motioned for him to take a seat at the long table. We've had wildling attacks before, but nothing like this, Gior began, his voice grave. They're more organized, more determined. Maekar met the old bear's eyes with a serious expression. They've already attacked Deepwood Mot. Gior's eyes widened in alarm. Deepwood Mot? It is an invasion. He bellowed, his fists clenching. How have the Watch allowed this to happen? I've already sent word to Winterfell from Deepwood Mot, Maekar replied. Reinforcements will be coming soon, and my uncle will be investigating the wall to see how this breach could have occurred. Gior sighed, a mix of relief and frustration in his gaze. You Starks have never let us down before. I hope this will be over soon, he muttered. Maekar nodded confidently. Do not worry, my lord. A single Northman is enough to take on 10 wildlings. Bah! Gior bellowed with a hearty laugh. Well said, my boy, well said. Chapter 8, The Crippled King. Rhaegar has the same taint of madness as his father, but a different type. As you can see in this chapter, his mind is all over the place. He found himself in a dense forest. Rhaegar knew he was dreaming, for he was pain-free, and he could use his legs like he could before the Battle of the Trident. The trees around him had an almost oppressing familiarity. He walked slowly, and with every step, he became more certain of his surroundings. This was the same place he had met her Lyanna Stark. The memories flooded back, vivid and haunting. He had found her here, taking off her armor after she had competed as the Mystery Knight the night of the Laughing Tree. As he walked to the exact spot where he had once found her, his heart pounded with a mix of nostalgia and dread. He found no one, just the empty clearing. But then, a voice pierced the silence, a voice he thought he would never hear again. Looking for me? He turned abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. There she stood, Lyanna Stark. Her appearance was just as he remembered, dark hair cascading in waves around her face, piercing grey eyes that seemed to see right through him. She wore a simple dress, a stark contrast to the armor she had once donned in this very spot. He knew he was dreaming, but he wished he could wake up. He could not face her, not even in a dream. Lyanna's lips curled into a bitter smile. Didn't expect to see me after you used me and threw me away, she said in a faux sweet tone. No, no, no. I loved you, Lyanna, he tried to argue, his voice desperate. A lie you tell yourself, she snapped back. You never loved me. You manipulated me, abducted me, and used me so you could fulfill your mad prophecy. No, no, that's a lie, he protested, shaking his head as if to dispel her accusations. Admit it, Rhaegar, she said with venom. In the end, I won. You never got what you wanted. You never got your Visenya. No, Lya, I loved you, he insisted, his voice breaking. If you loved me, why abandon our son? She asked, her voice softening but filled with pain. He faltered, the words failing him. He had no answer. At least admit to yourself, Rhaegar, Lyanna continued, her gaze unwavering. You are your father's son. He stood there, silence hanging heavy between them, the truth he had been running from now staring him in the face. The forest around him seemed to close in, the weight of his actions pressing down on him as he faced the ghost of the woman he had once loved. He woke up with a start, the haunting vision of Lyanna's accusations still echoing in his mind. He looked around frantically, realizing he was in his chambers. It was a dream, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the lingering fear and guilt. He attempted to stand up, a task that had been difficult for him since that fateful day at the Trident when Robert's Warhammer had left him a cripple. With great effort, he found his cane and, leaning heavily on it, managed to get to his feet. Slowly, he made his way to the table near a window where there was a pitcher of water. He splashed his face, the cold water a harsh but necessary shock to his body. He turned and looked at himself in the mirror next to the table. The handsome features he had once been known for were long gone. His body, once strong and graceful, had shriveled over the years due to being confined to a chair. It was only 5 years ago that he had regained the ability to walk, a small but significant victory in his otherwise constricted life. With great effort, he walked to a nearby chair and sat down, breathing heavily. As he tried to compose himself, the door to his chambers opened, and Arthur Dane entered. "Your Grace, shall I let the servants in?" Arthur asked. "Yes," Rhaegar answered, his voice carrying a note of weariness. Arthur nodded and stepped aside, allowing 3 maids to enter the room. "Prepare my bath and set out my clothes. I have a small council meeting today," Rhaegar commanded, his tone firm but not unkind. "Yes, Your Grace," the maids bowed and began their tasks with practiced efficiency. As the maids prepared his bath and laid out his clothes, Rhaegar leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The dream had left him unsettled, but he had responsibilities to attend to. The weight of his crown felt heavier with each passing day, especially with the lingering shadows of his past haunting his every step. Many thought him a weak king for bending so easily to the lords and their demands, but he could not let another conflict break out. Even though the power of the crown had weakened significantly by his actions, he knew it did not matter. He knew when the cold winds blew and the long night came, they would all fall under the dragon's banner. His son Aegon would lead them to victory. Though he never got his Visenya from Lyanna, the birth of his sister, Daenerys, gave him hope that the 3 heads of the dragon were complete. "What of Maekar?" a voice in his head asked. When Brandon Stark had demanded Maekar be sent north with him, Rhaegar had initially refused. It was a preposterous demand. But his advisors had pressured him, reminding him that they were losing the war and that loyalist morale was dangerously low. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Maekar would leave for the north at age 6 and return when he was 12. Weeks after Maekar left, he received devastating news. The ship carrying his son had sunk. Maekar was presumed dead, and with him, the last connection to Lyanna. The loss plunged him into a deep state of sadness, a grief that felt insurmountable. He only began to emerge from this darkness when he received word from the Lord of Winterfell that Maekar had miraculously survived. Though Maekar was safe, the Lord of Winterfell had decided he would stay in the north. His advisors suggested reprimanding the Lord of Winterfell, but he ultimately decided that his son would be safer there, away from the political machinations of King's Landing. "He has his 3 heads, there is no need for him," he thought. A voice echoed in his mind, Lyanna's voice, accusatory and cold. "So you admit you used me?" He shook his head vehemently, trying to dispel the thought. "No, it's not true," he muttered to himself, his hands clutching his head as if to silence the voices. "Your Grace!" A maid's gentle voice broke through his turmoil. "Your bath is ready." Rhaegar blinked, grounding himself back in reality. He nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadying. With great effort, he stood up and made his way to the bath, the warm water offering a brief respite from his troubles. Rhaegar slowly made his way to the council chamber, Arthur Dane and Jaime Lannister following closely behind. Both had offered to help him walk, but he had shooed them away, determined to maintain his dignity despite his frailty. As he walked, his thoughts churned with the myriad problems he had to deal with this month alone. Hoster Tully's illness had necessitated the departure of Edmure Tully from the capital, a decision that met with some opposition. However, the River Lords had been demanding for years to have the heir of Riverrun returned to them. Then there was the West, where Tywin Lannister had been stewing since his defeat by Brandon Stark. Jaime's refusal to leave the Kingsguard had further strained Rhaegar's relationship with the Old Lion. The Stormlands still refused to kneel to Jon Connington, looking instead to Stannis Baratheon to lead them. Meanwhile, the Reach and Dorne were pestering him about the sudden rise of the North. Brandon Stark had somehow changed the fortunes of his frozen kingdom, trading ice and paper of all things, and now the North was growing in wealth. Rumors circulated that it was not Brandon behind this resurgence, but his son, Maekar. He paused in his steps, a sudden thought striking him. Was the dream he had about Lyanna a sign? Was she telling him to bring Maekar to the capital? The notion gnawed at him, but he quickly dismissed it. No, he thought to himself. He would not be safe here. With a sigh, he continued his slow progress to the council chamber. The weight of his responsibilities felt heavier with each step. The kingdom was fracturing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The tension between the regions, the ambitions of various lords, and the resurgence of the North all demanded his attention. Finally, he reached the doors of the council chamber. Arthur and Jaime pushed the doors open, and he entered. As he stepped inside, his hand and friend, Jon Connington, moved to assist him, but like Arthur Dane and Jaime Lannister before him, Rhaegar waved him off, determined to make his way unassisted. He surveyed the room. Kevin Lannister, the master of coin, sat with a ledger open before him, his expression characteristically stoic. Jon Arryn, the Master of Laws and one of the few former rebels on the council, was present, a constant reminder of his attempts to heal the rifts within the realm. Then there was Varys, the Master of Whispers, Pakester Redwine, the Master of Ships, and Grand Maester Pycelle, who was the only man still serving other than Varys from his father's time. "Where is my son?" he asked. The council remained silent. "Arthur, where is Aegon?" he asked. "Aegon did not come to the training yard today, Your Grace," Arthur replied. "You mean this entire week?" Jaime chimed in. Rhaegar's expression changed to one of anger. His son, the once bright boy, had been particularly rebellious against him lately, shirking his duties. Elia had been a mediator between them, but she and Rhaenys were in Dorne, and his son was acting out to anger him. "Let's begin," he said, controlling his rising anger. The meeting began, but Rhaegar found it difficult to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the dream he had of Lyanna. What did it mean? He hadn't dreamed of her in years. He hummed and nodded along as the council members talked until he was pulled from his thoughts when Jon Connington addressed him directly. "Your Grace, what should we do about the Parchment Makers Guild? They are complaining about the new competition from the North's paper." "We could consider taxing the paper more heavily," Connington suggested. Rhaegar blinked, bringing himself back to the present. "I apologize, Jon. Please repeat what you said." Connington nodded, a look of concern briefly crossing his face. "The Parchment Makers Guild is complaining about the competition from the North's paper. They are asking for heavier taxes on the paper to protect their market." Rhaegar sighed, considering the proposal. "Do what you must, Jon. If taxing the paper more heavily will balance the interests, then so be it." Connington acknowledged the decision, but before he could move on, Varys spoke up. "Your Grace, there is another matter that requires your attention. Euron Greyjoy has been spotted in the Iron Islands." A murmur of surprise and concern rippled through the room. Euron Greyjoy was one of the most notorious and hated pirates in the world, wanted by all the free cities for his cruelty. In Westeros, he was equally despised, having been exiled by Balon Greyjoy under the threat of death for kinslaying. "Are you sure?" Rhaegar asked, his eyes narrowing. "Yes," Varys replied with certainty. "My little birds confirm his presence." Rhaegar's expression hardened. "Send word to Balon Greyjoy. Tell him to capture his brother and bring him to the capital for execution. We cannot allow a man like Euron to roam free." The council members nodded in agreement, recognizing the gravity of the situation. "If that is all, my lords, I must take my leave," Rhaegar announced, rising from his seat. The council members stood as he did. With his king's guard escorting him, he left the council chamber, his thoughts fixed on his heir. "That boy," he muttered under his breath, frustration evident. He stopped and turned to Arthur. "Find him and bring him to me." Arthur nodded and was about to leave to fulfill that order when Rhaegar called him. "No, I will come with you." One of the major issues he had to contend with was the matter of Aegon's marriage. He wished for him to marry Daenerys, as he believed it essential to unite the Targaryen bloodline and fulfill their destiny as the conqueror intended. But he never announced these plans as his advisors and the faith would be staunchly opposed to it. "They don't see it," he thought to himself as he walked. "They will when winter comes." As he arrived at his son's chambers, he was met with the sounds of a woman. He entered the room to see Aegon in bed with a maid. Seeing him, the maid let out a scream of surprise and quickly scrambled off the bed, hastily grabbing her clothes and fleeing the room with a look of mortification. Aegon only looked annoyed at the incident. "Why were you not at the council?" Rhaegar demanded, his voice low and controlled. Aegon remained silent, his gaze fixed on Rhaegar. Rhaegar wanted to say more, to express the depth of his disappointment, to tell his son about his importance as he had many times in the past. But the words wouldn't come. Shaking his head, he turned and left the room, the heavy door closing behind him with a sense of finality. As he walked away, the weight of his burdens seemed to press even more heavily upon him. Chapter 9, Hunting. Maekar followed Daisy through the dense forest, having left Mormont Keep at the first light of dawn. True to her word, Daisy had decided to take him hunting. As they walked, he found himself distracted, his eyes fixed on her firm, round ass that swayed seductively with every step. He found it hard to focus on the hunt ahead. His imagination was running wild as they walked in silence, his thoughts turning back to their previous encounters in Winterfell. He was broken out of his thoughts by Daisy, who had stopped by a fallen log. "I saw the moose here last week," she said, her voice low. They were both armed with bows and arrows. She had mentioned there was a large moose in the area and was eager to bring it down. "Let's find that moose," he said, taking an arrow out of his quiver. "But first," she continued, her smile turning mischievous, "I want to play a game." Maekar raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, what game? Remember when you jested about playing a game during our final hunt at the Wolf's Wood? A game where we strip clothing every time we miss a shot?" she asked. "Oh," Maekar replied, a grin spreading across his face as he caught on to her suggestion. "I like where this is going. Before we track the moose, I thought we could shoot some snow grouse. If one of us misses, then we take off a piece of clothing," Daisy explained. "Strip hunting," Maekar muttered with a laugh. "That sounds like a good name for it." Daisy nodded in agreement. "Fine. Prepare to lose that cloak," Maekar boasted, spotting a grouse nearby. He took aim and released his arrow, hitting the bird squarely and bringing it down. "Look at that, one down," he said with a smile. Daisy smiled back, unfazed. "Well, the game is just beginning," she said. They began the game. Maekar spotted another grouse, but his arrow flew wide, missing its mark. He groaned in mock frustration as he removed his cloak and tossed it aside. Daisy laughed, her eyes gleaming with mischief. She knocked an arrow and aimed at another grouse, but her shot went wide as well. With a playful sigh, she removed her fur-lined gloves, letting them fall to the forest floor. "Guess it's a bit colder now," she teased. They moved further into the forest. Maekar missed another shot, this time at a grouse that darted out from behind a bush. He grumbled good-naturedly and took off his leather jerkin. "Have you gotten more muscular, Maekar?" she asked, glancing at him. "Well, it has been a year," he replied with a smirk. Daisy's turn came again, and this time her arrow landed well short of its target. She shrugged off her outer cloak, revealing a snug, woolen tunic underneath. Maekar watched her with growing suspicion that she was missing on purpose, but why would he complain? "I think you might be doing this on purpose," he said, half joking as he scanned for another grouse. "Who, me?" Daisy replied with mock innocence, her eyes twinkling. "Just bad luck, I suppose." The hunt continued, and Maekar finally hit a grouse. But soon after, Daisy missed another shot. With a graceful movement, she pulled off her tunic, revealing a thin undershirt that clung to her form. The sight made Maekar's pulse quicken. "You're not making this easy on yourself," Maekar quipped. Daisy just smiled, undeterred. She took aim once more, but this time the arrow glanced off a tree, missing the grouse entirely. "Oops, missed again." With a dramatic flourish, she slipped off her boots, her bare feet now resting on the cool forest floor. Maekar took another shot and missed. "Aha, looks like I missed," he said, his eyes roaming her body. He took off his tunic, feeling the cool air against his skin. Daisy took aim again and missed, her arrow striking a rock instead of the intended target. With a small smile, she pulled off her undershirt, leaving her in just her breeches and a thin shift. "I must be really out of practice," she said, her voice light and teasing. He knocked another arrow, his hands steady despite the growing anticipation. He hit his target once more. Daisy's turn came again, and she deliberately aimed wide. "Something must be wrong with my aim," she said with a seductive smile, unfastening her breeches and sliding them off, leaving her in just her shift. "Looks like I'm losing this game," she said, her voice sultry. Maekar couldn't help but laugh, shaking his head. "You might be, but I'm not complaining." It was Maekar's turn, but Daisy drew her bow once more, eyes narrowing as she aimed at a distant snow grouse. With a soft exhale, she released the arrow, and it flew wide, missing its mark completely. She lowered her bow and turned to Maekar with a mischievous grin. "Looks like I missed again." Standing before him, she was now only in her small clothes. Without hesitation, she began to untie the last of her garments. Maekar watched, his breath catching as Daisy slipped off her small clothes, leaving her completely nude. Daisy stood before him, her body naked and glistening in the morning sunlight. Her skin was flawless, pale and smooth, with just a hint of pink on her cheeks from the cold air. Her breasts were full and round, with perky pink nipples that stood at attention. Her stomach was flat and toned, with a hint of muscle from her daily training. Her hips flared out gently, leading down to a heart-shaped ass that seemed to beg for attention. She stood there unabashed, a smirk playing on her lips as she looked at him. "Well," she said, breaking the silence, "I guess I've lost the game." "I think it's safe to say you did," he replied. "Your turn," she said, her voice low and husky. "I thought I already won," he said, walking closer to her, his cock hard and throbbing inside his breeches. He closed the distance between them. "I guess you have earned a reward then," she murmured, taking his hand and leading him deeper into the forest. Her nude form swayed seductively in front of him as she led him deeper into the forest. Every stretch of her long, smooth legs and sensual curves was hypnotic. She led him into a small clearing hidden from view by a thick screen of bushes. Maekar noticed that Daisy had prepared ahead, a blanket was spread out on the ground. "Looks like you planned ahead," he said. "I did say I was planning something," she replied. She stepped towards him, pressing her naked body against his. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin and the softness of her breasts against his chest. He pulled her closer, their lips crashing together in a passionate kiss. "The hunt will have to wait." A ship sailed silently by the shores of Bear Island, bearing the grim sigil of the Greyjoys a Kraken. Small boats descended from the ship, filled with wildlings from beyond the wall. They began rowing toward the shore, the occupants eager and restless. On one of the boats, the leader of the wildlings, a fierce man with scars crisscrossing his face, turned to one of the Ironborn. "Why not send us to the mainland? Why here, to Bear Island?" he asked, his voice rough. The Ironborn man, his expression unreadable, simply replied, "I have my orders." The wildlings began to talk among themselves, their voices filled with savage excitement. "We can kill all the kneelers on the island and make it our own," one of them said, his eyes gleaming with bloodlust. As the shore approached, the wildlings jumped off the boats, splashing into the shallow water and celebrating as if they had already won. Their laughter and shouts echoed across the quiet beach, a chilling sound that promised violence and chaos. The Ironborn turned to the wildling leader. "Remember our deal," he reminded him, his tone dark. The wildling leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Yes, I know what to do," he said. Maekar lay panting with Daisy on top of him, their bodies entwined in the aftermath of sex. He looked up at her, a playful smile on his lips. "Should we look for that moose now?" he asked, his breath still coming in short gasps. Daisy, also panting, shook her head. After some time, she replied, her voice soft and content. She pulled up to him to kiss him again. Just then, his ears caught a faint sound in the distance. He froze, sitting up abruptly, which alarmed Daisy. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern creeping into her voice. He silenced her by gently placing a finger on her lips. He strained his ears, trying to catch the sound again. It was the old tongue, spoken by the wildlings. He looked toward the direction of the sound and saw two wildling women walking in the direction of the shore. Daisy followed his gaze and spotted them as well. She immediately began to dress. "We should go back to the keep and return with reinforcements," he suggested, his voice low but urgent. They quickly dressed and made their way back to Mormont Keep. Once they arrived, they found Gior and informed him of what they had seen. Gior's reaction was immediate. Within minutes, a fighting force was assembled. Maekar, Daisy, her mother Maej, Yora, along with the Mormont men and the men Maekar had brought with him, prepared to ride out. Arriving at the shore, they spotted the wildlings disembarking from small boats. He was the first to notice the Ironborn ship anchored nearby. His eyes widened in realization. "Ironborn," he muttered. Gior saw it too and bellowed, "Iron fuckers! They're the ones ferrying those savages here. Kill them all," Gior commanded. They charged forward on horseback, clashing with the wildlings in a fierce melee. Maekar drove his spear through the chest of one wildling, then pulled it free and swung it around to catch another across the jaw. Daisy, riding alongside him, used her morning star to bash in a spearwife's head. Maej and Yora were equally formidable, cutting down wildlings with practiced efficiency. Gior Mormont, on his horse, swung Long Claw, cleaving through the wildlings with a strength that belied his age. "For Bear Island!" he roared, rallying his men. Maekar's spear flashed in the sunlight as he thrust it into the stomach of a wildling charging at him with a crude axe. The wildling fell to the ground, blood pooling around him. He spotted a wildling barking orders and spurred his horse forward. He thrust his spear, piercing the wildling's heart. As the leader fell, the remaining wildlings began to falter. They started to retreat, fleeing towards the sea. But the Mormonts were relentless. Uron led a group of men to intercept the fleeing wildlings, cutting them down in the waters. When the last of the invaders had been dispatched, Maekar stood on the blood-soaked beach. Around him, the Mormont warriors cheered, their victory complete. Gior approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Well fought, my prince. You did House Stark proud today." But Maekar did not speak, his mind was racing. It seemed the Ironborn and the wildlings were working together. "Ironborn," he said, turning to Gior. Ironborn. "This is worse than I thought," Gior said, staring out at the retreating ship. Chapter 10, We Do Not Sow. Asha Greyjoy. Pike, 298 AC. Asha stood at the docks of Pike, watching the ships arrive from all over the Iron Islands. The docks were a chaotic hive of activity, crowded with sailors, dockworkers, thralls, and merchants. The scent of salt water mingled with the smell of fish and tar. Ships of all sizes lined the piers, their sails furled and masts swaying gently with the movement of the tide, their hulls adorned with the sigils and colours of various houses of the Iron Isles, from the golden Kraken of House Greyjoy to the silver scythe of House Harlaw. The castle of Pike itself loomed above the docks, its craggy towers and fortress-like walls jutting out of the rocky promontories. The sea crashed against the rocks below, sending up a fine mist that hung in the air. The atmosphere was tense, a palpable anticipation thrumming through the crowds. All of this activity was due to one man, her uncle, Euron Greyjoy. Exiled by her father, the Lord Reaper of the Iron Islands, 10 years ago, Euron had become a feared and dreaded name on all the seas in the known world. He had returned a year ago, bringing with him riches beyond imagine and even sporting Valyrian steel armor, which he claimed to have found while exploring the ruins of old Valyria. His return had sparked a frenzy among the Ironborn, who saw in him the promise of a return to the old ways of raiding and reaving. Her father had welcomed his brother back, declaring that Euron had paid the iron price. Since then, Euron had been whispering in her father's and her brother's ears, filling their heads with dreams of rebellion. He told them that the dragon was weak, that the 7 kingdoms were ripe for the taking, and that if they rebelled, the realm would fall apart. She watched the comings and goings on the docks with a wary eye. She knew the dangers of listening to Euron's silver-tongued promises. The Ironborn were being rallied to a cause that could very well lead them to ruin. Euron's return had brought a dangerous allure, a tantalizing promise of power and glory, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was all built on a foundation of blood and lies. She wanted to believe in the dream Euron spun, but deep down, she knew it would end in disaster. The Greenlanders hated the Ironborn, and they would all rally behind the dragon, even the former rebels. She saw her younger brother walking towards her with a broad smile. He had been one of those most influenced by Euron's return, his ambitions stoked by their uncle's dangerous ideas. "Look at that, sister. The Greenlanders have no chance. When was the last time this many ships were assembled here?" Theon exclaimed, his excitement palpable. She sighed inwardly. Theon, like her other brothers, was swept up in the fervour that Euron had ignited. They were foolish, but they were her family, and she would support them to the end. "Come, Theon," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Father will hold court soon." She led her brother away from the bustling docks and towards the looming castle of Pike. Her grandfather had the right idea, as her uncle liked to tell her. Quellan Greyjoy wanted the Ironborn to reform, become traitors, and be the navy of the 7 kingdoms, but his children, including her father, wanted a return to the glory days where they could reave and pillage. But her grandfather was dead and now her father ruled. She glanced back at the throng of ships and sailors. The sight was impressive, yet it filled her with a sense of foreboding. The Ironborn's dream of returning to the old ways would be met with fierce resistance by the Greenlanders. Entering the dark and weathered halls of Pike, they made their way to the Great Hall, where Balon Greyjoy would soon hold court. The stone walls were adorned with banners of House Greyjoy, and the hall was filled with the murmurs of Ironborn lords and captains, each eager to hear the latest plans for their rebellion. Theon walked beside her, his excitement undiminished. "Father will surely have great plans. Euron has been a true blessing." Asha forced a smile, keeping her doubts to herself. "Yes, let's hear what father has in mind," she replied. They entered the crowded hall packed with Ironborn lords and captains, their faces alight with excitement and fervour. At the far end of the hall, on the raised dais, sat her father, Balon Greyjoy, on the sea stone chair. To his side, resplendent in his Valyrian steel armor, was Uron. Her uncle's armor was a sight to behold. It was dark and sleek, with an almost oily sheen that seemed to absorb the light around it. Intricate patterns were etched into it, giving it an otherworldly appearance. Also present were Roderick and Maron, her older brothers, standing with a sense of pride and expectation. Her uncles, Victarion and Aeron, were there as well. They made their way to the raised dais, where her father stood to address the gathered crowd. "My fellow Ironborn, we stand on the brink of a new era. My father, Quellan Greyjoy, sought to weaken us with his reforms, to bend the knee to the Greenlanders. He believed in peace, but peace has only made us weak. Aegon the Conqueror may have ended our golden age, our rule over the weak rivermen, but his dragons no longer rule the skies." The crowd murmured in agreement, their attention rapt. Her father continued, "Now, the dragon is weak, and the Greenlanders are weaker still. They squabble among themselves, their kingdoms divided. Now is our time. We will raid from the wall to the arbor, reclaiming what is ours by right." A roar of approval went up from the crowd, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "We do not so," Balon shouted, raising his fist. "We will take their women and make them our salt wives. We will carve our legacy into the very bones of their land." The crowd erupted into chants of King Balon. King Balon! The fervor in the room was palpable, the Ironborn ready to follow their king and his plans for conquest. Aegon Targaryen. King's Landing, 298 AC. Aegon was always a sickly child, teetering on the brink of death until he was 4. For years, everyone expected him to die, but he did not. He survived and overcame his weakness. His father had high expectations for him, placing immense pressure on his shoulders. He tried and tried to live up to those expectations, striving to become the perfect heir his father wanted. But despite all his efforts, he realized he would never impress his father. The constant pressure and disappointment took a toll on him, leaving him feeling inadequate and frustrated. Sometimes, he even felt a great envy for his so-called bastard brother in the north. Maekar didn't have to suffer under a father like Rhaegar Targaryen. He imagined Maekar living a simpler life, free from the suffocating expectations that plagued him daily. His mother had understood him, always comforting him when his father scolded him for not keeping up with his studies or missing a lesson with Arthur. His relationship with his sister was also worsened due to his father. As she grew distant from him, she was eventually sent to Dorne to foster. It was in this loneliness that he made a pivotal decision. He decided to stop trying to impress his father and instead live a life that could make him happy. This choice led him to seek out new friends, people who understood and accepted him without the burdensome expectations. One such friend was Joffrey Lannister, the heir to Casterly Rock, who introduced him to the finer pleasures in life. Leaving the Red Keep in the evening, he and Joffrey decided to visit a new brothel in the city. He sat in a comfortable, plush chair in a dimly lit room. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, and the air was filled with the scent of exotic perfumes and incense. Joffrey sat next to him, drinking wine. The madam of the brothel, a striking woman named Lysera, moved gracefully before them. She clapped her hands, and a line of beautiful girls entered the room, each one more captivating than the last. "My prince, my lord, may I present to you the finest jewels of King's Landing," she said, her voice smooth and inviting. She began to introduce each girl in turn. "This is Illyra, with hair as golden as the sun and eyes like emeralds." A slender girl with long, flowing hair stepped forward, her gaze meeting his with a flirtatious glimmer. "And here we have Mira, with lips as red as rubies and a body that could tempt even the most pious of men." A voluptuous brunette gave a playful wink. Joffrey leaned in close, his voice low. "I want that one." And finally, this is Yera, a fiery spirit with a passion to match. A fierce, raven-haired girl looked directly at him, her eyes burning with intensity. "What do you think, Aegon? Any of these lovely ladies catch your eye?" Joffrey asked. "It's hard to choose," he replied. Lysera, sensing his indecision, smiled knowingly. "Take your time, my lord. The night is young." He stood from his seat and began to inspect the women before him. He touched and slapped them playfully, eliciting giggles from the women. He loved the attention they gave him. He enjoyed the freedom and power he felt in these moments. Just as he was about to make his choice, the door to the room swung open, and Jaime Lannister stepped in. Aegon looked at Jaime with a smile. "Ha, I knew you Kingsguard didn't take your vow seriously," he said. Jaime remained unfazed. I am not here for this, he said, his voice firm. He turned to the women, who quickly gathered their belongings and left the room, much to Aegon's disappointment. Your father has called a council, Jaime continued. You must come quickly. He sighed. Very well, Aegon replied, trying to mask his frustration. He straightened his clothes and gave one last longing look at the women outside. Jaime turned his gaze to Joffrey. Nephew, you should come as well. Joffrey protested, what? Why? Jaime gave him a stern glare. Fine, Joffrey said, following Aegon out of the brothel. They arrived at the council room, where his father, Rhaegar, and the other council members were already seated, their faces grim. He took a seat beside his father, and Joffrey sat beside Kevin, who looked pale. Seeing their serious faces, Aegon couldn't help but quip, who died? Rhaegar turned to Aegon, his expression severe. The Ironborn have attacked and sacked Lannisport, he said. They destroyed the Lannister fleet, Kevin added. How? When? Jeffrey asked in shock. His father stood up and turned to him. You, my son, must lead the armies of the Seven Kingdoms and crush this rebellion. He stood and met his father's gaze. The old fire within him, the desire to impress his father and prove himself worthy, burst into life. The Ironborn will pay for what they have done, he declared. Chapter 11, Starkport. Daisy screamed out in pleasure, her body trembling as Maekar fucked her from behind. The sensation was overwhelming, and she felt herself losing control. His rough hands gripped her hips tightly, guiding her to meet each of his powerful thrusts. With every movement, a rush of intense pleasure coursed through her. As he increased the speed of his thrusts, her moans became more and more desperate. Yes, yes. Maekar, don't stop. She gasped between breaths. Her legs began to shake uncontrollably, and she knew she was close to the edge. Come for me, she-bear, he whispered in her ear. That was her limit. A powerful wave of ecstasy washed over her, and she cried out his name one last time before collapsing onto the bed. She felt the warm sensation of his seed slowly making its way down her back, tracing the contours of her spine before dripping onto the bed beneath them. Gods, that was great, she said, breathless. That was the last one before I leave. Had to make it count, Maekar said, equally breathless. They laid on the bed in silence for some time, too tired to talk. I have to go. I've delayed the ship long enough, he said, getting up. Daisy lay on the bed, exhausted, watching him dress. Be careful, Maekar. If this is a rebellion. I promise I'll be careful, as long as you promise to be careful as well, he replied. He leaned in to kiss her forehead softly. I'll see you when I see you, he said with a wink, walking out of the room. He left Bear Island on the Mormont's fastest ship, part of a small fleet they were building with the help of Winterfell. He sent word to his uncle about the happenings on Bear Island and the information they had gleaned from the captured Ironborn after the beach battle. The Ironborn had been ferrying thousands of wildlings past the wall in the last week alone. He knew Uncle Brandon would soon be inundated with ravens from the houses near the wall as the wildlings wreaked havoc. These actions from the Ironborn meant only one thing: rebellion. He knew about the Greyjoy rebellion from the books but had hoped it wouldn't happen here, given the vastly different circumstances with Rhaegar winning and the realm still being ruled by the dragons. Yet, it seemed the rebellion was inevitable, just delayed. Now, almost a week after he left Bear Island, he was nearing Starkport. He was excited to see Robb again and hoped that the Ironborn hadn't attacked their new port on the west coast, as he knew it and the new fleet Uncle Ned was building would be their first target in the north. He heard the sailors above announcing that they were approaching Starkport. He walked from his cabin onto the deck, where he was greeted with Starkport in all its glory. The port town was a bustling hub of activity, with a maze of wooden docks extending into the bay, filled with ships of various sizes and designs. Fishermen, merchants, and sailors moved about the place. The town itself sprawled from the shoreline, a mix of sturdy stone buildings and wooden structures, with narrow streets winding between them. Overlooking the growing town was Greycliff Castle. Named for the Grey Cliffs it was perched upon, it provided a commanding view of the entire bay. The castle was an impressive structure, built of grey stone and featuring tall, crenellated walls. Its towers reached high into the sky, and banners bearing the dire wolf of House Stark flapped in the wind. He also noticed a large number of ships, more than he had seen on his previous visits. War galleys, dramans, and smaller vessels were lined up, their crews busy with preparations. It was clear to him that Uncle Ned was preparing for war. The ship docked, and he disembarked, immediately seeing that he had a welcoming party. At the forefront was Robb Stark, his cousin. Robb had the classic Stark look, the long face, grey eyes and solemn demeanour. But unlike the other Starks, Robb had violet eyes, a striking inheritance from his mother, Ashura Dane. Robb rushed over and pulled him into an embrace, which he returned with equal warmth. "Good to see you again, Maekar," Robb said, his voice filled with genuine affection. "I wish it was under better circumstances," he replied, a note of seriousness creeping into his tone. "Yes, we heard what happened at Bear Island. Ironborn and wildlings together, what's the world coming to?" Robb said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Where is Uncle Ned?" he asked, looking around. "He's at the cove," Robb replied. "Ah, I forgot you had a hidden cove here," he said, a hint of curiosity in his voice. "Yes, we've been building the new ships there, away from prying eyes," Robb explained. "Let us go there. I want to see my ships," he said eagerly. "Your ships?" Robb asked with a playful frown. "Yes, my ships. I designed them. Now take me there," he insisted with a grin. Robb laughed and clapped him on the back. "Oh, how I missed you, cousin." They made their way through the bustling streets of Starkport. As they walked, Maekar couldn't help but notice the air of readiness that hung over the town. The preparations for war were evident everywhere he looked, from the blacksmiths working tirelessly to forge weapons and armor to the groups of men training in the open fields. The town was a matter of pride to the Stark family, and they would not let the Ironborn touch its soil. "Bring the horses," he heard Robb order. One of the guards nodded and soon returned with 2 sturdy steeds. They mounted them, and Robb began leading him to the hidden cove. After a few minutes of riding, they arrived at the natural harbour, surrounded by steep cliffs that provided excellent cover from prying eyes. Several new ships were docked there. These ships were designed by him with the help of the Manderley shipbuilders he had asked his uncle to bring to Winterfell 2 years ago. They were similar to galleons, much better than the carracks that already existed here. They were also supposed to be outfitted with a special weapon. "So, have the new ships been outfitted with the new weapon?" he asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Robb laughed. "Yes, Maekar, and it's glorious. I hope the Ironborn come," he added. They arrived at the hidden docks in the cove after a few minutes of riding, where he saw 5 impressive galleons anchored. The sight was magnificent. As they dismounted the horses and walked down to the docks, he saw Uncle Ned standing near the edge, his face lighting up with a warm smile upon seeing him. "Welcome, Maekar," said Uncle Ned, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I see that you have been busy, Uncle Ned," he replied, returning the hug. His uncle nodded and turned his gaze toward the galleons. "We named the first one after your mother," he said, looking proudly at the nearest ship. He looked at the ship. It was everything he imagined it to be: reinforced hull, larger sails, larger size. Along the sides, he could see the ballistay being installed. The ship itself had a formidable appearance. His eyes were then drawn to the complex mechanisms on the deck. "I see that you have managed to install the weapons," he remarked. "Yes, the weapons with Frostfire have been put in all 5 ships," Ned confirmed. "Frostfire, eh? Nice name," he said with a smile. "Well, nephew, you did tell me I could name it," Ned replied, a twinkle of amusement in his eyes. Frostfire, as Uncle Ned named it, was actually Greek fire, a more stable and safe version of the notorious wildfire. He had managed to make it, and it was sent to Starkport in secret, a potent weapon capable of devastating enemy ships with its intense, inextinguishable flames. "Come, nephew, let us return to Greycliff. You look like you could use some rest," Ned said, leading him and Robb back to the castle. Theon stood on the deck of his ship, the Iron Bitch, a fierce smile playing on his lips as he looked out over the churning waters. He had been planning and waiting for this day for months, ever since his uncle Uron had begun whispering of the rebellion that would free them from the mainlanders. His mind raced with dreams of glory and conquest. Perhaps he could carve out his own kingdom in the north, where he was now leading the fleet. The Starks had built a port on the stony shore and even had the gall to create a fleet of their own. He intended to teach them a harsh lesson about who truly ruled the seas. He did not expect much resistance from the northerners. They were landlubbers, after all. Didn't the Lord of Starkport have a daughter? Perhaps he should take her as his salt wife when he took the port. The thought brought a twisted grin to his face. Victarion, his uncle, had gone to Lannisport to attack the heart of the Westerlands. His brothers, Maron and Roderick, had been dispatched to the Reach and the Riverlands respectively, spreading their assault across the continent. And Uncle Euron, the man behind it all, had sailed south on some secret quest. Yes, Theon could see it clearly. The future of the Ironborn seemed bright. He envisioned the Ironborn reclaiming their ancient glory, raiding and reaving from the north to the south, their power unquestioned. It was going to be glorious. R12, Gossip. Maekar. Greycliff Castle. Robb moved opposite Maekar as they faced off in the training yard, the clang of steel and the thud of wood filling the air as they sparred. Maekar wielded his spear with precision, while Robb countered with his sword. Their movements were swift and calculated, each strike met with a parry or dodge. He feinted to the left, then quickly thrust his spear towards Robb's side. Robb blocked the attack with his sword, but his agility allowed him to pivot and strike again, this time sweeping Robb's legs out from under him. Robb landed on his back with a grunt, his sword clattering to the ground. He stood over him, the tip of his spear pointed at Robb's chest. "Yield," he said with a grin. Robb laughed, accepting his hand as he was helped to his feet. "Good one. You've improved." "Yes, I have," he replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "Remember the times when you always beat me?" Robb chuckled, shaking his head. "Looks like I've been slacking off. Also, is it wise to keep using a spear?" Robb asked. "It's served me well so far. I want to test its limits," he replied. "Let's end it here, I'm starving," he added, looking at the setting sun. They made their way into the castle, the cool stone walls a welcome relief to their sweat-filled bodies. Maekar glanced through the many windows of the castle, admiring the view. "I'm jealous of the beautiful view from the castle," he remarked. Robb nodded. "My chambers are in the perfect place. I can see the sunset perfectly from there." As they were about to climb the stairs, Arya ran over, her face set in a pout. "Are you done?" she asked in a despondent tone. "Yes, sister," Robb replied. "But I wanted to watch you fight," she complained. "Tomorrow, Arya. Now come, mother will be looking for you," Robb said, ruffling her hair. As they continued their journey to the family quarters, Arya looked up at him. "Did you see any bears on Bear Island?" He smiled down at her. "I saw many bears." Robb shot him a knowing look. "Yes, I'm sure you did more than that." "Shut up," he said, punching his cousin lightly on the arm. Arya looked between them, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," he and Robb said in unison, trying to suppress their laughter. After taking a long bath, Maekar went to have dinner with his uncle and family. He entered the hall with Robb, finding Uncle Ned already seated with Arya and Aunt Ashura, who was holding little Roderick. "Aunt Ash, as beautiful as ever," he said, sitting down. Ashura smiled at him, but her expression turned curious. "Maekar, I have been hearing some things about you." He sighed. "Has Aunt Cat been writing to you?" "She is just projecting," he said. "Projecting?" Ashura looked confused. He quickly corrected himself, realizing he had used a term from his previous life. "I mean, she is angry with Uncle Brandon, so she is trying to find some other reasons to be angry about." Ashura frowned slightly. "Still, it's not proper." Robb, sensing the tension, asked, "Is this about that?" He already knew about ROS. He quickly answered, "Yes." As they began eating, he turned to Ashura. "So, Aunt Ash, have you heard any gossip from the Red Keep?" Ashura had always been his main source of gossip during his stay in Winterfell. She kept him up to date on all things in the Red Keep, often with news directly from the Queen herself. "Has my dear brother finally gone mad under father's expectations?" he asked with a playful tone. Ashura sighed. "Such things are not to jest about, Maekar. I am just a concerned brother, Aunt Ash," he said, though his tone was teasing. She gave him a pointed look. "Well, fine, I am not. I just want to know what is going on. Is there nothing else for you to speak of?" Uncle Ned said, slightly annoyed. "Elia is in Dorne for a year, so I do not know what the happenings are in the Red Keep," Ashura said. "Oh, well, what of my uncle? Has he returned from his travels with your sister?" Maekar asked. Uncle Viserys had married Ashura's sister Alyria and had then decided to take her to travel all over Essos. Viserys was the only Targaryen he was in contact with, as he would send him gifts on his name day, sometimes letters as well. He was a wandering dragon who even helped him with a business deal in Bravos. No, they are in S area. Damn, they are far away, he remarked. The conversation shifted to other topics, the atmosphere lightening as they enjoyed their meal. The next morning, he and Robb stood before Uncle Ned in his solar. His uncle's expression was grim as he addressed them. Our fears are confirmed. The wildlings are wreaking havoc in the Gift and in the Wolfwood. Brandon is leading an army to crush them. Damn those squids, Robb muttered, his frustration evident. Uncle Brandon is going to make sure those savages wish they stayed behind the wall, he added. Ned nodded. If the Ironborn attack, we have the Ryswells, the Lords of Cape Crocken, and the Dustins to help us. What about the Manderleys? Robb asked. Their fleet cannot help us, Ned replied. Most of the north will be focused on the wildlings. Exactly what the Ironborn wanted, he said. But they don't know that we have new ships and a new weapon, Ned finished. Suddenly, the maester of the castle entered, his face pale. My lord, a missive from the Flints. They claim to have spotted a large fleet headed to Starkport. Ironborn, all three of them said together. When was this sent? Maekar asked, his tone urgent. A day ago, the maester replied. That means we have less than 2 days, Ned said, his eyes narrowing. Robb's face lit up with fierce resolve. Time to roast some squid, he said, his voice filled with anticipation. Aegon. Red Keep. So, when is your sister returning to the capital? Joffrey asked, lounging casually in Aegon's chambers. I do not know and I do not care, Aegon replied, his eyes fixed on the map of the Iron Isles spread out before him. She must be beautiful, Joffrey said, a smirk playing on his lips. Lannisport was sacked, and the west is being raided by Ironborn, the lands you will be ruling, and you are wondering if my sister is beautiful? Aegon asked, incredulous. Nothing gold can't fix, Joffrey dismissed Aegon's words with a wave of his hand. But I do need a lady to rule it beside me, he added, almost as an afterthought. Rhaenys and I are not close. We are as close as my bastard brother in the north, Aegon said, his tone bitter. Is he a bastard, though? Joffrey mused. Joff, either you have something to contribute to the war ahead, or you can leave, Aegon said sharply, suddenly beginning to cough. You can't even use a sword for more than a few minutes, Aegon, Joffrey said, standing up. This war will only let the realm see your weakness, he added before leaving the room. Weak. I am not weak, Aegon thought bitterly, his hands clenching into fists. He left his chambers and made his way to the council chambers, where a meeting was to be held. Arriving there, he found only his father, Rhaegar, and Jon. The sight of Jon always filled him with resentment. He did not understand why a traitor and rebel like Uron was on the council. To Aegon, it merely highlighted the weakness of his father's rule. As the council began and they discussed strategies to put down the rebellion, Varys entered with a grim expression, holding a letter. Your Grace, I have dire news, he said, his voice steady but somber. The Queen has been abducted, her ship was attacked in the Stepstones. Aegon felt faint, his vision narrowing. Then, he felt white-hot rage coursing through his veins. He struggled to maintain his composure as his mind raced. This cannot be, Rhaegar said, his voice barely above a whisper. The shock was evident on his face. Who did this vile deed? Jon asked. Euron Greyjoy. Varys answered. Aegon's fists clenched at his sides. We need to take our fleet and travel to the Stepstones immediately, he said, his voice trembling with anger. Greyjoy will pay for this. Jon spoke up, his voice calm and measured. We need to plan our next steps carefully. Rash action could lead to greater losses. Aegon shot him a withering look. Careful planning will not save my mother. We need decisive action. Decisive, yes, but not reckless, Uron replied, meeting Aegon's gaze. Aegon wanted to retort but he could not find the words. His mother was taken, if anything were to happen to her, he was going to make sure the Ironborn would never rise again. Chapter 13, Battle of Blazewater Bay. Maekar. Starkport. Maekar watched the docks, his eyes scanning the bustling activity as men and women prepared for the impending Ironborn attack. The plan was to meet the Ironborn at sea and use their new ships to crush and defeat them. He was confident that the new ships and the sailors, who had been in training for years, would be able to defeat the Ironborn. They had the element of surprise, after all. He saw Robb approach in full armor. "Let us leave for the cove," Robb said, motioning to the horses nearby. He nodded. Uncle Ned had assigned him and Robb to lead one of the galleons, the Lady Lyanna. He wondered who would be leading the Ironborn fleet here. With all of Balon's sons alive, considering the Ironborn thought the Northerners weak when it came to the sea, he could imagine Theon leading the fleet. They made their way to the hidden docks where the galleons were moored. The sight of the majestic ships filled him with pride. The time had come to take them to the sea. The fleet's battle formation was meticulously planned. The 5 galleons, including the Lady Lyanna, were positioned at the center of the formation. They were to lead the fleet and be the first to assault the enemy ships using the frostfire weapons installed on them. Behind them were 20 war galleys, their sleek designs built for speed and maneuverability. 10 dromons, heavy and formidable, flanked the war galleys, ready to provide additional firepower and support. As they sailed out to sea, Robb stood beside him, watching the fading silhouette of Greycliff Castle. "Why would the Squids rebel?" Robb asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "They are Ironborn. They are not known for their wits," he replied, a hint of disdain in his voice. Robb laughed, the sound cutting through the tension. Maekar, however, remained focused, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He twirled his spear absent-mindedly, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hand. After a few hours of tense sailing, the lookout's cry rang out once more, this time with more urgency. "Ironborn fleet, straight ahead." Maekar and Robb exchanged a determined look. Maekar moved to the front of the Lady Lyanna's deck, his spear in hand, and called for the attention of the crew. The sailors and soldiers gathered around. "Men of the north," Maekar began, his voice carrying over the sound of the waves, "for too long the Ironborn have plagued our people, raiding our coasts, and spreading fear and destruction. They have tormented our western coast, thinking they can come and go as they please, leaving nothing but ash and sorrow in their wake." He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued with rising fervor, "But today, we strike back. Today, we show them that the North is not to be trifled with. Today, we instill the fear of the North and its people into their very bones." A roar of approval erupted from the crew, their cheers echoing across the water. The sight of the determined faces around him filled him with a fierce pride. He raised his spear high, the glint of steel catching the sunlight. "For Winterfell! For the North! For Winterfell! For the North!" The crew shouted back, their voices a powerful chorus of unity and strength. Theon! Blazewater Bay! Theon stood on the deck of the Iron Bitch, watching the so-called Stark fleet approach. One of the sailors next to him, a grizzled man with a weathered face, pointed to the 5 ships leading the fleet. "What sort of ship is that?" he asked, eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of unease. He narrowed his eyes, trying to discern the nature of the approaching vessels. "I don't know," he whispered, a sense of foreboding creeping over him. But then he straightened, forcing confidence into his voice. "Do not worry. What do the Northerners know of shipbuilding?" he declared, though the certainty in his voice was slowly waning as the ships drew closer. As the strange new ships in the front approached, Theon prepared for the inevitable clash. He watched, confusion turning to horror, as the ships began to spew flames from weapons mounted on their sides and from ballistae whose heads exploded upon impact. He saw a ship heading toward his, and before he could give the order to change course, a burst of fire, the same fire that was destroying his fleet, erupted from it. Unnatural fire arced through the sky before hitting the side of his ship. The fire spread with terrifying speed, engulfing the wooden vessel in a matter of seconds. Sailors screamed as they were caught in the inferno, their bodies writhing and blackening as the flames consumed them. His eyes widened as he saw bolts from the ballistae strike a nearby ship, the explosion of fire spreading like wildfire across the deck. Men leapt overboard in a desperate attempt to escape the blazing inferno, their screams echoing across the water. The sea itself seemed to catch fire where the flames hit, creating patches of burning oil that clung to anything it touched. "By the drowned god!" he muttered, unable to believe what he was seeing. He felt the heat of the flames even from his position, the searing light reflecting off the water and turning the battlefield into a nightmarish scene of fire and death. His heart pounded as he realized that the Northerners had brought more than just ships, they had brought a weapon of unparalleled destruction. He could see the other Ironborn vessels struggling, their crews in chaos as the flames spread. Ships were ablaze, masts toppling, and men were burning alive or drowning as they tried to flee the inferno. Another burst of flame struck his ship. He was thrown to the deck, the smell of burning wood and flesh filling his nostrils. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the carnage around him. His confidence was shattered, replaced by a stark realization of the deadly trap they had sailed into. "Prince Theon! We're losing ships fast!" One of his crew shouted, panic evident in his voice. Theon could only stare in disbelief as the Stark fleet continued their assault, the new ships methodically unleashing their fiery wrath upon them. The once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He couldn't think, couldn't strategize, all he could do was watch as his fleet was systematically destroyed. His ship shuddered violently again, they were being boarded. He scrambled to his feet, still reeling from the fire attack, and saw a figure who looked like a Stark cutting through his crew with a spear. The man moved with deadly precision, each thrust and strike claiming another life. He took up his sword, his heart pounding in his chest. He approached the man, his steps shaky but determined. As he got closer, he realized who this deadly warrior was, the prince he had been ordered to take alive. The prince turned to face him, his spear glistening with the blood of his men. His first swing was wild, fueled by desperation. The prince parried effortlessly, countering with a swift jab to Theon's leg. Pain shot through him as the spear pierced his flesh, and he staggered back, barely keeping his balance. They circled each other, Theon trying to find an opening. He lunged again, but the prince sidestepped and struck Theon's arm with the butt of his spear, numbing it and causing his sword to slip slightly in his grip. He tried to swing again, but the prince was faster, his spear slashing across his other leg, dropping him to one knee. His strikes became more frantic, but each one was met with a swift, precise counter. The prince seemed to be toying with him, inflicting painful but non-lethal wounds. Theon's arms and legs were soon covered in cuts, his movements growing sluggish and desperate. "Fight me properly!" he yelled, but his voice lacked the conviction he wished it had. He swung wildly, but the prince caught his sword with his spear, then took hold of his arm and twisted it, sending the sword clattering across the deck. He fell to the ground, gasping for breath, his body racked with pain. He looked up at the prince, who stood over him, his face cold and devoid of pity. "I surrender," Theon croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Good," the prince replied coldly. He turned to his men. "Kill them all." His eyes widened in horror as he saw the Northmen move to execute the remaining Ironborn crew. Before he could react, a sharp blow to the back of his head sent him sprawling into unconsciousness. The last thing he remembered was the cold, merciless gaze of the Northern Prince and the screams of his dying men. Chapter 14, Celebrations and Interrogations. Maekar returned to the ship with Theon bound and gagged. The crew and other soldiers looked at him in awe and respect. As he and Robb stepped onto the deck, they were met with thunderous cheers. "Prince of Winter! Prince of Winter!" the crew chanted, their voices echoing across the water. The cheers for Robb were equally deafening. "Bloody Wolf! Bloody Wolf!" they chanted, inspired by his terrifying appearance covered in blood, not his own, but that of the Ironborn he had slain. "Take this scum to the brig," he ordered, gesturing to Theon. The Ironborn prince was dragged away, met with jeers and curses from the crew. "You look like you bathed in the blood of 1,000 men," he said, turning to Robb. "I did," Robb replied with a wink. Maekar turned to the crew. "Now let us return to our home and celebrate our victory," he yelled, raising his spear high. More thunderous cheers erupted. Maekar looked to the sea and counted their ships. It seemed only a few had been damaged, and all were afloat. The Ironborn ships were either sunk or burning in frost fire. The ships turned back towards Starkport, cheers and celebrations already starting. After a few hours, they sailed triumphantly into the harbour, the Stark banner fluttering in the breeze, signalling their hard-earned victory. As they disembarked, the docks of Starkport were alive with activity. Townsfolk and soldiers alike gathered to welcome the victorious fleet. As Uncle Ned stepped on the docks, the people gathered around him, cheering. "Lord of Greycliff! Hail to Eddard Stark! Long may he live! The bane of the Ironborn!" Their ship was docked, and as they were disembarking, Uncle Ned rushed to Robb and enveloped him in a big hug. He then proceeded to pull Maekar into a hug as well. "Today, you have proven yourselves," Ned said, his voice filled with pride. Around them, the men and townsfolk began chanting. Stark, Prince of Winter, Lord of Starkport, the Bloody Wolf. The air was filled with jubilant energy, the crowd's voices rising in a powerful chorus. Ned raised his hands, calling for silence. And now, we celebrate, he declared. The crowd roared again in approval, their cheers echoing through the streets. The celebrations began immediately, with musicians playing lively tunes and townsfolk dancing in the square. Fires were lit, and tables were quickly laden with food and drink. Maekar and Robb stayed with the townsfolk while Uncle Ned left for the castle with Theon. After some time, some soldiers led them to a raised platform where they could address the crowd. Today, we showed the Ironborn that the North is not to be trifled with, he declared, his voice strong and clear. We fought bravely, we fought fiercely, and we emerged victorious. Robb stepped forward. To the men who fought with us, and to those who supported us from home, this victory belongs to all of us. The cheering grew even louder, the crowd celebrating their shared triumph. The celebrations continued long into the night, the streets of Starkport filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of mugs. The men and women of the North celebrated their victory, knowing that they had proven their strength and resilience to the world. He watched the celebration with pride, knowing the part he played in it. His fame in the North was set in stone. In the future, he would need their support. He looked forward to the months ahead. He would use the rebellion to gain glories and ensure that his name and fame would spread in the South as well. A small step in his ever-growing ambitions. He stood with Robb and Uncle Ned in the dungeons, ready to interrogate Theon. The room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of damp stone and blood. Theon, badly burned from the frost fire, was brought before them, his face twisted in pain. Theon glared at them, his voice hoarse as he spat out, "What monstrous weapon have you created?" One of the guards struck him hard. "Do not speak, scum," the guard said, his voice filled with contempt. Ned raised his hand, stopping the guard. "We know Lannisport has been sacked. Where else are you planning to attack?" Theon spat at his uncle, his defiance unbroken. Ned wiped the spit from his face, his expression unyielding. "I ask again. Where?" Theon remained silent, his eyes full of hatred. Uncle Ned nodded to the guard, who delivered a brutal blow to one of Theon's burns on his leg. Theon grimaced, but still, he said nothing. Another guard struck him again, the sound of the impact echoing through the dungeon. Seeing it was not working, Maekar stepped forward, looking at Theon coldly. He drew a knife and held it up for Theon to see. "Take off his pants," he ordered. Ned, Robb, and the others in the room looked at him, bewildered. "Maekar, what are you doing?" Robb asked, but Maekar ignored him. He leaned in close to Theon, his voice a deadly whisper. "If you don't tell us, I am going to cut your cock off." Theon's eyes widened in terror. The guards began to pull at his pants, but Theon yelled, "Stop! Stop! I'll tell." Maekar gestured for the guards to pause. "Then speak," he said. Theon, shaking and terrified, began to spill everything. We plan to attack the Riverlands and the Reach next. Maron and Roderick were sent there. Victarion went to Lannisport, and Uron has a different plan. He's gone south for something secret. I don't know what it is." Maekar sheathed his knife, stepping back. "Take him back to his cell," Uncle Ned ordered the guards. "And make sure he's watched closely." Uron entered his cabin with a wide smile, his lips stained blue and wearing his Valyrian steel armor. The sight of him was enough to strike fear into anyone, but the woman tied to the chair near the table met his gaze defiantly. She was Elia Martell, the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. "You may have captured me, but it won't matter," Elia said, her voice steady and full of resolve. "Your rebellion will fail." Uron walked closer, his smile widening. He grabbed her head roughly, his fingers digging into her scalp. "I do not care for the rebellion. They can all die for all I care." Elia's eyes widened in shock at his words. She had expected a madman, but this was something else entirely. He let her go and went toward the table nearby. Her gaze shifted to the table as well, where a map of West Eros lay spread out. Skagos was marked with a large circle. She also noticed a large, ancient horn in the room, covered in Valyrian inscriptions. "I did not abduct you for some futile attempt at winning this rebellion," Uron continued, his tone dripping with malice. "I did it to lure out your son." Elia's shock turned to fury. "Leave my son alone." You will not lay a finger on him. Uron's smile turned cruel. Do not worry. You will be meeting him soon enough. He is close, I can feel it. And when he is here, I will be one step closer to godhood. He laughed maniacally, the sound echoing off the wooden walls of the cabin. Elia's defiance began to waver, replaced by a growing terror. Chapter 15, Entrapment. Jason Mollister looked at the burning docks of Elysia, the town near Seagard, with despair etched on his face. The Ironborn were killing and raping throughout the town, their savage cries echoing across the waterfront. He and his men had been caught unawares, and now he had no choice but to retreat back to Seagard and prepare for a siege. The acrid smell of smoke and the sight of flames engulfing the town filled him with rage. He saw his son, Patrack, running towards him through the chaos. The booming tower rang for the first time in 100 years as the townsfolk retreated to the castle. Jason knew the town was lost, and he knew what he had to do. Retreat! Jason called out to his men. Retreat to Seagard. Patrack turned to his father, desperation in his eyes. No, father, we can still defeat them. No, boy, we can't, Jason ordered fiercely. Retreat? Patrack hesitated but eventually nodded, his expression one of sadness and resignation, as he led the men back to Seagard. Jason stayed behind to ensure the last of his men made it safely out of Elysia. The Ironborn were relentless, but so was he. He would protect his people, no matter the cost. Once the last of his men and the townsfolk had retreated, Jason led the remaining group back into the safety of Seagard's walls. The castle gates closed behind them with a resounding thud. Inside, Jason made his way to the battlements. From his vantage point, he could see the Ironborn swarming towards Seagard, their ships dark silhouettes against the fiery backdrop of Elysia. The Ironborn were numerous and well-armed, their intent clear, to take Seagard by force. A siege it is, Jason thought grimly, gripping the cold stone of the battlements. He turned to his men, who were already preparing for the defense. Archers lined the walls, ready to rain arrows down upon the attackers. Boiling water was being readied, and the gates were reinforced. Seagard had withstood 1,000 Ironborn sieges, and Jason knew it could withstand another one. Sir Arthur Dane and Sir Barristan Selmy of the King's Guard led the armies of the Crownlands, their banners fluttering in the wind as they marched westward towards Seagard. The soldiers, clad in their armor and bearing the sigils of their houses, moved with determined purpose, their footsteps creating a rhythmic thud that echoed through the countryside. The column of soldiers stretched for miles, a formidable force that included infantry, cavalry, and archers. Knights rode alongside their retainers, their lances held high, and squires hurried to keep pace, carrying extra supplies and equipment. Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, rode at the front with Barristan Selmy, the Bold, by his side. As they rode, Arthur turned to Selmy, a hint of concern in his voice. Was it wise to have Prince Aegon lead the fleet? Arthur asked, his brow furrowed. Selmy nodded thoughtfully. Prince Aegon is not viewed favorably by the rebel kingdoms. If he proves himself in this crisis, many will begin to view him favorably. Arthur sighed, his worry evident. Aegon is not prepared. Selmy gave a small, encouraging smile. Sometimes wars can change people, Arthur. Aegon might return a changed man, more motivated and resolute than he was before. Arthur glanced at Selmy, his expression skeptical but hopeful. I hope so, Barristan. For the sake of the realm, I hope so. Aegon stood on the deck of the flagship of the royal fleet, the Balerion, his mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts and emotions. They were at the stepstones now, and soon they would reach the west coast of Westeros. There, he planned to meet up with the Redwynes, whose fleet had taken massive losses, and free the Arbor and the Shield Islands. From there, he would link up with the armies of the Reach and Dorne to march to the Westerlands, and finally to the Iron Islands, where he planned to end the Ironborn threat once and for all. But his mind was clouded by the recent news of his mother's abduction. When they last made port at Tarth, he had received word that the Silence, Euron Greyjoy's dreaded warship, was still sailing around the Stepstones, evading the remaining Dornish fleet which had also been attacked at port by pirates, likely paid off by Euron. The thought of his mother in the clutches of that monster filled him with a rage that burned hotter than dragon fire. He had made a decision. He couldn't take the entire fleet to chase the Silence, as the Arbor and the Reach were in peril and needed their support. But he couldn't ignore his mother's plight either. He decided to break from the plan and take 5 ships to chase down the Silence and free his mother. It was a risk, but one he was willing to take. He looked to the ship sailing next to him where Montfort Velaryon stood. He waved, signaling them to leave. He watched them disappear into the horizon. Now, he needed to find Euron Greyjoy. He led the 5 ships through the stepstones, searching for his mother. They sailed around Bloodstone after hearing rumors he was there. He then decided to dock in Bloodstone where he questioned some pirates who told them the Silence was headed into the Sea of Dorne. Realizing he had no other choices, he led the ships west into the Sea of Dorne. It was 2 days into the journey that he found his target. The sun was setting when the lookout cried out from the top, "Ship spotted! It's the Silence!" He rushed to the prow, his eyes locking onto the infamous vessel, its black sails billowing ominously against the setting sun. The Silence was alone. Aegon's heart raced with a mix of determination and dread. "Give chase!" he ordered, his voice carrying over the deck. The ships surged forward, the wind catching their sails. The crew worked tirelessly, the thought of rescuing their queen driving them onward. As darkness fell, they closed in on the Silence, the gap narrowing with every passing minute. He knew they couldn't attack outright, fearing for his mother's safety. He watched as Euron's ship led them into a small island chain where the waters were shallow and treacherous. The captain approached him, concern etched on his face. "Your Grace, these waters are dangerous. We should proceed with caution." "Follow them," he ordered firmly. "We can't let them escape." Suddenly, from the surrounding islands, ballistae fired upon them. Massive bolts streaked through the air, their deadly accuracy sinking 4 of the ships almost instantly. Only the Balryon remained, heavily damaged but still afloat. The crew scrambled to keep the ship steady as the Silence turned and sailed directly toward them. "Prepare for battle!" Aegon yelled, his voice ringing with urgency. The Silence closed in, and the Ironborn swarmed over the sides of the Balryon, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. He found himself in the thick of the fight, his heart pounding. He was protected by Sir Aerys Oakheart of the King's Guard, who fought valiantly to keep the attackers at bay. "My prince, stay back!" Sir Aerys commanded, parrying a vicious strike. "I want to fight!" he shouted, frustration and desperation mingling in his voice. But the King's Guard were unyielding, their duty clear. Suddenly, arrows rained down, striking with deadly precision. One by one, his guards fell, arrows piercing their armor and finding their marks. Sir Aerys too dropped to his knees, an arrow through his eye, falling lifelessly at his feet. He gripped his sword tightly, his knuckles white. He turned to face the oncoming threat, his eyes locking onto Euron Greyjoy. The man's lips were stained blue, his expression a mask of malevolent glee. His armor shimmered eerily in the moonlight. Aegon advanced, and he swung his sword with all his might. But Euron was faster, deflecting the blow effortlessly. He struck back with brutal force, his attacks relentless and overpowering. He tried to defend himself, but each strike from Euron sent shockwaves of pain through his body. Euron's movements were almost serpentine, his strikes precise and powerful. He knocked the sword from his hand with a swift motion and delivered a crushing blow to Aegon's head with the hilt of his own weapon. The world spun around him as he fell to the deck, his vision darkening. The last thing Aegon saw before slipping into unconsciousness was Euron's wicked grin, the sound of his maniacal laughter echoing in his ears. Chapter 16, The Calm. Maekar watched as Tara, the maid assigned to his room, skillfully positioned her mouth around his cock. He let out a moan of pleasure as Tara's lips worked smoothly, taking him deep into her throat. Ever since he arrived, Tara had been giving him hints of her interest towards him. After all, he was the hero who had saved the town and the north from the Ironborn. When she came to prepare his bath today, he decided to give her what she wanted. "Yes, suck it, you whore," he growled. Tara stopped, pulling away from his cock. "I'm no whore," she asserted. "And yet you suck like one," he said, pushing her head down once more. With a lustful glare, she took him into her mouth again. The room filled with the sounds of her lips slurping on his cock. He pushed her head down further, her eyes wide and eager as she continued to suck. He could not wait any longer. Lifting her effortlessly, he carried her to the bed. Her plush curves pressed against his body as he laid her down. His hands reached down to her cunt, playing with her wet folds and teasing her with his fingers as he slipped them inside. She gasped at the sensation and squirmed beneath him, her hips pushing forward in anticipation. Positioning himself at her entrance, he pushed into her slowly, savoring the feeling of her tightness gripping him. Tara's body was warm and welcoming, her walls squeezing him in the most pleasant way possible. His hips thrust forward, sliding out and then back in again, filling her up completely with each stroke. My prince, Tara said, biting her lip from ecstasy. She met each of his thrusts with equal force, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that quickly became faster and more urgent. My prince, please don't stop, I'm so close. Oh, gods! Feeling himself getting close to climax, he quickened his pace even more. Finally, with a long, deep thrust, he came inside her. Their bodies trembled together as wave after wave of pleasure coursed through them. He collapsed on top of Tara, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. After a few moments, he rolled off her and lay next to her. I was right about you, Tara said, still breathless. He responded. I told the others that you would be good in bed, she said. Maybe you could return tonight with the others you mentioned, he said, holding her closer to kiss her. But he was interrupted by a knock on the door. Who is it? He asked, annoyed. Lord Eddard is calling for you, my prince, the guard replied. He sighed. Looks like we are done for now, love, he said, getting up. Tara got up and dressed as well. Bring your friends tonight, he said with a wink. I'll try, she replied with a giggle. He made his way to his uncle's solar, noticing the golden hues of the setting sun casting long shadows across the corridors. Damn, I really did spend the whole day in that room, he thought wryly. As he approached the solar, he could hear the murmur of voices inside. Stepping through the doorway, he saw several lords gathered, including Roderick Riswell, Willem Dustin, and other northern lords. Ah, Maekar, good you are here, Uncle Ned said, looking up from the table. The other lords turned to him, their expressions respectful. He could hear some of them whisper Prince of Winter under their breath. My lords, he said, bowing slightly. Good to see you, Prince Maekar, Roderick Riswell greeted him. Good to see you again, Lord Riswell, Maekar replied. Prince Maekar, Willem Dustin said. Willem was familiar to him, as he was Uncle Brandon's friend and had visited Winterfell from time to time. Willem, good to see you, he responded warmly. The ships you have helped to make are something, my prince, Lord Flint said, admiration in his voice. Everyone around the room murmured in agreement, nodding their heads. Uncle Ned raised his hand to call for silence. My lords, we have a grave situation in Seagard. The Ironborn are laying siege to it. The Shield Islands have fallen. He paused as the maester entered, handing him a scroll. His uncle's face grew even graver as he read the contents. My lords, I have grave news, his uncle said, his voice heavy with concern. What is it, Ned? Rhaegar Riswell asked, his voice tense. The Queen has been captured by Euron Greyjoy, Ned announced. A shocked silence fell over the room, quickly replaced by a rising murmur of alarm and disbelief. He took some time to absorb the news as well. He did not know how to feel about it. He looked to Uncle Ned, who seemed to be in deep thought. My lords, he called out, raising his hands to quiet them. We must lead our fleet to lift the siege of Seagard. Yes, the Queen has been captured, but that does not mean we can leave our allies in the south to be ravaged by the Ironborn. We must show the power of the north and its fleet. It's time for the south to see our new strength. The lords cheered, their voices rising in a unified roar of approval. Uncle Ned nodded in approval, his eyes meeting Maekar's with a hint of pride. Safe to say I have the north in my corner, he thought happily. He played with his little cousin Rhaegar, who was only 2 years old but already quite a handful. The boy kept attacking his legs with a small wooden sword. Oh no, the Dread Wolf has defeated me, Maekar said dramatically, faking a fall to the ground. Rhaegar roared with laughter and celebrated his victory, running around in circles. Thankfully, his maid, who was standing nearby, quickly ran after him, scooping him up and carrying him away. As Maekar dusted himself off, he saw Robb approaching. So, Bloody Wolf, how do you feel about your new titles? He asked with a grin. Robb chuckled. It's strange, but I like it. They talked for a while about the rebellion and other family matters. The night was cold, and the moon shined the brightest. So, Maekar, what do you plan to do? Do you still plan to return to the capital? Robb asked. Robb was the only one he had confided in about his plans to return to the capital one day. He also knew about his ambitions, though not that he wanted to be king. Yes, Robb, I still plan to go, Maekar replied, a determined look in his eyes. Robb sighed, concern etched on his face. Why, Maekar? You've already made your name here. Maekar looked out into the distance. I still want more. I want to keep climbing the mountain. Robb shook his head, his expression serious. Just hope you won't fall off the mountain, cousin. The higher you are, the greater the chance you could fall and die. Robb left, leaving Maekar alone with his thoughts. He pondered his cousin's words, understanding the concern behind them. The ambition that drove him also carried great risks. But the call of destiny was strong, and Maekar knew he had to follow it, no matter the dangers. He returned to his chambers to find Tara there, and he was even more surprised to see 4 more beautiful women of her age. Well, Tara, you kept your word, he said with a smile. Tara smiled back, a mischievous glint in her eyes, and began to shrug off her clothes. The other women followed suit, giggling as they disrobed. This is going to be a long night, he thought, a grin spreading across his face as he prepared to enjoy the company of these lovely women. Chapter 17, The Storm. The fleet was once again made ready, this time with more ships to carry the men that the Dustons, Ryswells and other northern lords had brought with them. The docks were a flurry of activity as soldiers boarded the ships, supplies were loaded, and final preparations were made. The air was filled with the sound of clanking metal, shouted orders, and the creaking of wood as the ships prepared to set sail. They had received further news that the Ironborn had attempted to take Moat Cailin but were repulsed by the combined forces of the Manderleys and the Reeds. Meanwhile, Uncle Brandon had pushed most of the wildlings out of the Wolf's Wood and was preparing for a final push. They were going to sail to Seagard, which was under siege by the Ironborn. He boarded the Lady Lyanna once again. Robb was with him, as they were once again given command over the ship. As the fleet sailed south, Robb approached him. Want to spar? He asked, a grin on his face. Yes, let's, he replied, eager for the distraction. They took to the deck, drawing a small crowd of soldiers who watched with interest. The clashing of their weapons filled the air as they moved through the practiced motions of combat. His mind, however, was elsewhere. As he parried and struck, his thoughts drifted to Elia. Elia had never been cruel to him in the Red Keep. She had ignored him, yes, but there was no malice in her eyes, only sadness. He wished for her to be safe, but a small, dark part of his mind whispered, wouldn't it be better if she were dead? Wouldn't it be better if Aegon died too, in this rebellion? He quickly shook off those thoughts, but they lingered at the edges of his mind. If he wished to be king, Aegon needed to be removed. He didn't consider himself completely heartless, but the thought weighed heavily on his conscience. Distracted, he lowered his guard, and Robb's practice sword tapped against his shoulder. You are distracted, Maekar, Robb said, concern in his voice. I need some time to myself, he said, lowering his sword. Robb nodded, understanding. He walked to the railing, looking out over the endless expanse of the sea. The waves crashed rhythmically against the ship's hull, and the wind carried the salty tang of the ocean. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to ponder the difficult questions he had been putting off. What did he truly want? Was it the crown, the power, or something else entirely? The path to kingship was paved with blood and betrayal. Could he walk that path without losing himself? He thought of Aegon. He held no love for his half-brother, but he was still family. Could he bring himself to remove Aegon, knowing what it would cost? And yet, the ambition within him stirred, whispering that sacrifices had to be made for the greater good. He gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white. The internal conflict raged within him, the pull between ambition and morality tearing at his soul. He knew that the decisions he made in the coming days would shape his destiny and the future of the realm. As they neared Seagard, they spotted a fleet of 15 Ironborn ships. Uncle Ned, who was leading the fleet, surged forward in full sail, signaling them to do the same. The battle unfolded much like the one in Blazewater Bay. The Northern Fleet utilized the devastating power of Frostfire. As they unleashed the inferno upon the Ironborn ships, the vessels crumbled before their eyes. Flames danced along the water's surface, turning the sea into a blazing inferno. Their ships closed in, and he prepared to board the Ironborn vessels. The Ironborn, many too injured to fight or already dead, offered little resistance. Those still able to fight were quickly subdued by them. After an hour of fierce combat, the Ironborn fleet was destroyed. The Stark fleet continued to sail, and soon, Seagard came into view. Seagard Castle was a formidable structure of stone and iron. Its high walls and sturdy towers were designed to withstand sieges, and its strategic position overlooking the waters made it a crucial stronghold. However, the town surrounding the castle was in shambles. Maekar looked through his fair eye. Fires raged unchecked, and thick plumes of smoke curled into the sky. The destruction was evident in the collapsed buildings and the bodies that lay scattered in the streets. The castle itself was besieged, ironborn swarming around its base. The defenders of Seagard were valiantly holding their ground, but it was clear they were outnumbered and exhausted. "Prepare for battle!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the deck. "It's time to kill some squids." The crew responded with a fierce cheer, their weapons gleaming in the light of the setting sun. The ironborn pelted them with arrows as they rowed toward the shore, the projectiles thudding against the wooden hulls of their boats and the shields of the men. He ducked beneath his shield, glancing at Robb beside him. "Want to make a bet?" he asked, with a grin on his face despite the chaos around them. "Now?" Robb replied, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," he answered, his grin widening. "Sure," Robb said, adjusting his grip on his sword. 1,000 gold for the first one to kill the Greyjoy leading the attack here, he proposed. "Deal," Robb agreed, his eyes gleaming with determination. They reached the shore and leaped from the boats, charging the Ironborn with a ferocity that belied their youth. The battle cries of the northern men filled the air as they clashed with the Ironborn, the sound of steel against steel ringing out across the battlefield. Maekar moved with practiced precision, his spear and shield working in perfect harmony. The first Ironborn lunged at him with a brutal swing of his axe, but he parried the blow with his shield and countered with a swift thrust of his spear, piercing the man's chest. The Ironborn fell to the ground, clutching the wound as his lifeblood spilled out. Another Ironborn came at him, swinging a sword in a wide arc. He sidestepped the attack and brought his spear down in a vicious stab, impaling the attacker through the stomach. With a fierce yank, he pulled his spear free and spun to face the next threat. The third Ironborn was more cautious, circling him with a wary eye. He lunged forward, but Maekar anticipated the move, blocking the strike with his shield and slamming the edge into the Ironborn's face. As the man staggered back, Maekar thrust his spear into his throat, ending the fight. The fourth Ironborn tried to flank him, but Maekar was prepared. He swung his shield in a powerful arc, bashing the man's head and knocking him off balance. With a swift and precise motion, he drove his spear into the Ironborn's heart, the force of the blow driving the man to his knees before he collapsed, lifeless. Breathing heavily, Maekar scanned the battlefield, his eyes searching for Robb. Amidst the chaos, he saw his cousin fighting with equal ferocity, cutting down Ironborn warriors with his sword. Their bet forgotten in the heat of battle, both were consumed by the singular purpose of driving the Ironborn back into the sea. Maekar saw that his uncle, Lord Dustin, and Lord Roderick were fighting their way into the town, pushing back the Ironborn with every step. More Ironborn reinforcements streamed from the castle, but the northern forces held their ground, cutting through the invaders with relentless ferocity. He knew that Lord Mullister was waiting for the right moment to strike from the castle. Whoever had planned this siege was an idiot for not establishing proper defences. Then he spotted him, the Greyjoy leading the assault. Standing with some 50 men, shouting orders, it was one of Theon's brothers. He racked his brain for the name. Roderick. Yes, Roderick Greyjoy. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, and taking him down would be a significant blow to the Ironborn forces. Robb noticed him too. They shared a look of understanding. Maekar called out to the men near him, rallying them for the charge. "To me!" he shouted, pointing his spear towards Roderick Greyjoy. They surged forward. As they neared, Maekar and Robb called out to Roderick. "Face us, Greyjoy!" Maekar demanded. Roderick turned, a sneer spreading across his face. "I am Roderick Greyjoy, Crown Prince of the Ironborn, and I will kill you both," he boasted, drawing his sword. Before Maekar could engage, 2 Ironborn warriors attacked him from the side, forcing him to fend them off. Robb stepped forward to face Roderick, their swords clashing with a resounding crash. Maekar focused on his own battle, his spear moving with deadly precision. He parried a blow from one Ironborn, thrusting his spear into the man's chest. The second warrior came at him with a wild swing, but Maekar dodged and struck with the edge of his shield, knocking the man off balance before driving his spear through his heart. With the 2 Ironborn dispatched, Maekar turned just in time to see Robb decapitating Roderick Greyjoy, his sword slicing cleanly through Roderick's neck. The head fell to the ground with a thud, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the remaining Ironborn, seeing their leader fall, began to flee in panic, their morale shattered. The northern men let out a victorious roar, their spirits lifted by the sight of their enemies in disarray. Maekar and Robb stood side by side, breathing heavily, their weapons stained with blood. The battle for Seagard was turning in their favor. "Well done, Robb," he said, clapping his cousin on the shoulder. Robb nodded. "And you, Maekar?" The retreating Ironborn were cut down by the northern forces as they fled, their disorganized ranks unable to withstand the relentless assault. The defenders of Seagard, seeing the tide turn, launched their own counterattack from the castle, striking at the Ironborn from behind. As the last of the Ironborn were driven from the city, Lord Mullister raised his sword high and screamed out, "Victory!" His voice echoed across the battlefield, a triumphant cry that signaled the end of the siege. The defenders of Seagard, along with the northern forces, erupted into cheers, their voices mingling in a chorus of triumph and relief. Chapter 18, The Madman. Arthur Dane. The Riverlands. Arthur looked over the vast army of 10,000 men, resting after a long day of marching. They were camped along the Seven Streams, a picturesque area where several small rivers converged, creating a network of waterways that wound through the lush, rolling landscape. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the fields and forests, the water shimmering like liquid gold. The air was filled with the sounds of soldiers talking, horses neighing, and the distant rush of the streams. Their current plan was for Prince Aegon, after defeating the Ironborn in the south, to bring the royal fleet to Ironman's Bay, where they would ferry the army to the Iron Islands and finally put an end to the rebellion. Arthur hoped the prince would be successful. His thoughts drifted to the other prince, the one in the north. Would he be at Seagard? He closed his eyes, trying to forget the events at the Tower of Joy, something he had been trying to forget for a long time. Would Prince Maekar be there, or would he be with his other uncle fighting the wildlings? He had heard of Prince Maekar's hand in the rise of the north in recent years. Several loyalist lords had even pressured Rhaegar to order Lord Brandon to send him to the wall. But Brandon was intent on keeping his nephew in the north, and as long as Maekar was there, there would be no threat to Aegon's claim to the throne. He hoped Maekar would stay away, as many rebel lords still wanted to finish what they couldn't 16 years ago. His thoughts were interrupted by the approach of Sir Barristan Selmy. "The scouts have reported that Eddard Stark has lifted the siege of Seagard," Barristan announced. Arthur's eyebrows rose in surprise. "My sister did write to me of the new fleet her husband was building," he said, "but I did not expect them to be this effective." The lords of the Crownlands gathered around them, eager to hear the news. "This makes things easier for us," Barristan said, a note of relief in his voice. "Sir Barristan is right," agreed Lord Massey. "Now we only need to wait for Prince Aegon to arrive." "Why wait for the prince? Perhaps we can use the new northern fleet to ferry the army to the Iron Isles," another lord suggested. The lords began to argue, some still holding grudges against the Starks, recalling how Brandon Stark had ravaged the Crownlands during Robert's rebellion. The conversation grew heated, old resentments flaring up. "Enough," Arthur said firmly. "We shall decide when we arrive at Seagard." The lords reluctantly nodded and dispersed, leaving Arthur and Barristan alone. Arthur sighed, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "I am getting too old for this," he said, rubbing his temples. Barristan let out a hearty laugh. "Then what about me, my friend?" Arthur chuckled, the tension easing slightly. "You still fight like a man half your age, Sir Barristan." Aegon. The Narrow Sea. Aegon sat in the brig of the Silence. He had failed again. His search for his mother had led to his own capture. A bitter laugh escaped his lips as he felt like his mind was beginning to fracture. The sound of approaching footsteps broke through his thoughts. Two men opened the door to his cell and dragged him out. He tried to resist, but it was in vain. They dragged him to the deck of the ship. The fresh air was a welcome change, but it did little to alleviate his despair. On ships, the sound of the sea and the crew always intermixed, but he only heard the sound of the sea. The crew was strangely silent and looked as much in despair as he did. He was taken to the captain's cabin where, for the first time since his capture, he felt happy and relieved seeing his mother. She was alive, though bound and gagged in a chair. Tears ran down her cheeks as she looked at him, her eyes filled with anguish and fear. Aegon was forced into a chair and bound as well, the men who brought him not uttering a single word before they left the room. "Mother, did he hurt you?" he asked frantically, his voice shaking. Elia shook her head, but she was clearly trying to convey something else, her eyes wide with terror. Her expression changed to one of horror again as they both heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see a man in black armor standing in the doorway, a wide smile on his face. "Welcome, my prince," to the silence, the man said, his voice dripping with malevolence. "My name is Uron, your humble host." He bowed mockingly. Aegon remained silent, his eyes fixed on Uron with a mixture of defiance and fear. Uron walked into the room, his presence commanding and intimidating. He moved with an air of arrogance, his every step measured and confident. "It is a pleasure to have such esteemed guests aboard my ship," he continued, his smile never wavering. Aegon clenched his fists, struggling against his bonds. "What do you want with us?" he demanded, his voice tinged with anger. Uron laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the cabin. "What do I want? Oh, so many things, my prince, so many things. I would speak to you more, but I do not have much time, you see," Uron said to Aegon, pulling a knife from his scabbard. Elia began screaming through her gag, her eyes wide with terror as she seemed to beg Uron silently. "You will get nothing from me," Aegon said defiantly, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. Uron chuckled, twirling the knife casually. "Like I said, my prince, I do not have time for this. I have to go to Old Town before the rebellion I helped start is crushed. So let us make this quick. You have something I want, Prince Aegon." Aegon's mind raced. "What do you want?" "Your blood," Uron said, his smile widening. "The blood of old Valyria. I want you to say these words: I, the son of Valyria, willingly give my blood to you. Oh, and say it in Valyrian," he added. Aegon was bewildered. What was this madman talking about? His heart pounded as he stared at Uron, trying to make sense of the demand. "No," Aegon said firmly. Euron's smile faded, replaced by a cold, dangerous glint in his eyes. He stepped closer to Aegon, the knife gleaming menacingly in the dim light of the cabin. "You will say it," he said softly, his voice like ice. "Or," he said, turning his face to the Queen. His intentions were clear. Elia's muffled screams grew more frantic, she was telling Aegon to not give in to the madman's demands. "Do it, my prince," Euron whispered, his tone almost coaxing. "Save your mother." Aegon's mind raced. He couldn't bear the thought of his mother being tortured, but he couldn't give in to Euron's demands. He steeled himself, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. "No," he repeated, his voice trembling but resolute. Why do you have to make this difficult?" Euron muttered, striking Elia in the head twice, eliciting a scream from her. "No! No! No, stop!" Aegon screamed, his heart wrenching in terror. "Don't hurt her!" Euron grinned, the knife now dangerously close to Elia's throat. "Let's make this quick, shall we?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Say the words, little prince." A small wound formed on Elia's neck, a thin line of blood trickling down. Yes, I will say it." "Let her go, please." Aegon pleaded desperately. "Say it," Euron commanded darkly. "I, the son of Valyria, willingly give my blood to you," Aegon recited in Valyrian, his voice breaking with fear and desperation. Euron's smile widened as he slashed Aegon's hand, collecting the flowing blood into a small container. Good, he murmured, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Let my mother go, please," Aegon begged, his voice choked with emotion. Euron turned to Aegon with a sinister smile. "You're right. I have no need for her now. I will let her go." With one swift motion, Euron slashed Elia's throat. Blood poured from the wound as she gurgled, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Aegon screamed, a heart-wrenching "no!" that echoed through the cabin. He continued screaming, his voice raw with anguish as Euron laughed, the sound of his torment a symphony to the madman's ears. Euron walked off, leaving Aegon to his grief, the cruel laughter lingering in the air long after he was gone. Chapter 19, A Spar with a King's Guard. Eddard. Seagard. Eddard Stark stood on the battlements of Seagard, looking out over the arriving armies of the Riverlands and the Crownlands. The banners of several houses fluttered in the breeze, their colours vibrant against the backdrop of the approaching forces. Leading the troops were Ed Muir Tully, Arthur Dane, and Sir Barristan Selmy. He was surprised to find the siege of Seagard still ongoing when they arrived, he had only planned to battle the Iron Fleet here and had hoped the Tullus had already led the armies of the Riverlands to lift the siege. In the end, he and his men had to do it themselves. He smiled, thinking of how Robb and Maekar had distinguished themselves in battle. Robb had even killed Roderick Greyjoy. The Bloody Wolf, quite a name, he thought with pride. His nephew too had been called a new title, the people haven taken to calling him the Prince of Winter. Some called him Prince in the North. These worried him the most. He wanted Maekar to stay in the North where he would be safe. The South had taken too much from their family already. Descending from the battlements to meet with them on the ground, he saw Willem Dustin. "So, they finally come," Willem said. "They have," Eddard replied. "Come, let's greet them." Eddard and Willem made their way to meet the leaders of the arriving armies. Eddard spotted Lord Blackwood first. "Ned," Tiddos said, greeting him warmly. "A bit late, are we?" Eddard said in good-natured jest. Tiddos shook his head, frustration evident. "It was a muddle of events, Ned. We were delayed by the fucking king himself, and our future lord went along with it." Before Tiddos could continue, Arthur Dane and Ed Muir Tully approached. Tiddos excused himself. It was clear he was angry at the two approaching figures. Willem went with Tiddos as Eddard turned to the two men. Arthur and Eddard greeted each other. "How is my sister?" Arthur asked, concern in his eyes. "Is she safe?" "Yes," Eddard assured him. "The Ironborn did not touch northern soil. We were able to defeat them at sea." "Ah, the new fleet," Arthur said, nodding appreciatively. Eddard then turned to Ed Muir, his expression hardening. "Why were you delayed?" Ed Muir hesitated. "We waited for the armies of the Crownlands." Eddard frowned. "That was a foolish decision." Arthur interjected, his voice calm but firm. "It was the king's decision." "Then it was a foolish decision by the king," Eddard added without missing a beat. "You are the heir to the Riverlands, Ed Muir. You should have raised the armies and come here immediately." Arthur's eyes narrowed, and he was about to retort when Eddard spoke again. "Let's not dwell on it anymore. We need to plan our next steps." "We have already decided, Eddard. We will wait for the royal fleet and then invade the Isles," Arthur said. "I see, but let us have a council anyway. This afternoon is good, don't you think?" Eddard said. Arthur was silent for a moment before nodding. "Good," Eddard said, walking away. In the afternoon, the lords of the Riverlands, Crownlands and the North who were present gathered in the great hall of Seagard. The hall was filled with the murmur of voices and the clinking of goblets as the lords settled in for the meeting. Jason Mallister stood first, addressing the assembly. "I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Eddard Stark and the lords of the North for their help in lifting the siege of Seagard," Jason began. He then continued his speech, where Eddard was sure he could detect the hidden barbs directed at the late arrival of the Riverlands armies. As Jason finished his words, he stood and thanked the Lord for his kind words. Then Arthur stepped forward to explain the Crown's plan to invade the Iron Islands. He listened to the plan he had already heard before this morning. There were murmurs and some arguments against the Crown's plans, notably from the rebel houses. He noted the tension, understanding that the wounds from the rebellion had yet to heal fully. As Arthur finished, he asked, "What is Lord Lannister planning? Will he join us as well?" "Lord Lannister will be leading his armies here as well, after he dealt with the Ironborn invading the Westerlands," Arthur replied. Some lords called out that the Stark fleet was already here and they could use that and the Mallister fleet to invade. This was met with arguments that the Crown's plan was better. Seeing the council devolving into a fight, Eddard stepped forward to address them. "I can lead the Stark fleet to assist the royal fleet in the Reach," he began. "Why wait here with a good fleet? My ships are tested and proven to be effective against the Ironborn. The conflict at sea would end sooner if we were to assist the royal fleet." Many in the hall nodded in agreement with his plan. Arthur also seemed to agree. The plan was agreed upon when Jason Mallister suggested that both fleets could trap the Iron Fleet in the south and finish them off decisively. The meeting concluded with a consensus: the Northern Fleet would sail south to engage the larger Iron Fleet in the Reach, coordinating with the Royal Fleet to deliver a crushing blow to the Ironborn. Arthur. Seagard. As the evening approached, Arthur and Barristan made their way to the yard for a spar. Their conversation soon turned to the new Northern Fleet. "What do you think of your good brother's new fleet?" Barristan asked. "I am surprised by how effective it is," Arthur confessed. "The western coast will be far safer now that the Starks have their own fleet," Barristan said, always seeing the positive in things. As they approached the yard, they saw someone with the Stark look training with a sword. "Is that?" Barristan began. Arthur looked closer. He saw a boy with the Stark look, but he was too pretty to be a Stark in his opinion. Prince Maekar, he thought. Eddard did tell him the prince was here. "Yes, that is Prince Maekar. Lord Eddard mentioned he was here," he replied. He had also heard how the prince had captured Theon Greyjoy and proved himself during the Battle of Seagard. He had wanted Prince Aegon to show his leadership and skills to the kingdoms during this conflict, but all the lords and small folk could talk about was Prince Maekar and his bravery during the Battle of Seagard. "Prince Maekar," Barristan called, approaching the yard. "Sir Arthur, Sir Barristan," the prince said, nodding respectfully. "Your form is good," he remarked. The prince smiled. "Thank you. I'm familiarizing myself with the sword again, as I've been relying on my spear for too long." "Oh, you use a spear?" Barristan asked, intrigued. Maekar nodded. "It served me well, but I found it difficult to use during the battle last week." Arthur nodded in understanding. "A sword is better against armored knights. I might learn to use a spiked mace like my namesake, or..." He paused, a smile playing on his lips, "a warhammer." Arthur's face twitched slightly at the mention of a warhammer, remembering how Robert Baratheon had grievously injured Rhaegar with one. "A warhammer is a powerful weapon," he said, his voice neutral. "But it requires great strength and skill to wield effectively." "Yes, a challenge I'm willing to undertake," the prince answered. Arthur turned to the prince, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "Would you care for a spar, Prince Maekar?" The prince smiled and nodded. "I would be honored, Sir Arthur." The two squared off in the yard, drawing a crowd of onlookers eager to witness the match between the famed sword of the morning and the young prince. They began slowly, circling each other. Arthur moved first, his sword a blur as he tested the prince's defenses. Maekar parried, but he was initially on the back foot, still reacquainting himself with the feel of a sword in his hand. His strikes were precise and powerful, driving the prince back step by step. But as the spar continued, the prince's confidence grew. He began to adapt, his movements becoming more fluid, his parries and counters more effective. He was even close to landing a few blows on him, which he acknowledged with a nod of approval. He was impressed by the prince, but the spar was still one-sided. His experience and mastery of the sword were evident. He controlled the pace of the fight, his strikes calculated and relentless. Maekar did his best to keep up, but it was clear he was outmatched. Finally, the prince conceded, lowering his sword and stepping back. "It was an honor to fight you, Sir Arthur," he said, breathing heavily but smiling. Arthur nodded, sheathing his sword. "You have skill, Prince Maekar. Continue training with the sword. You have great potential." The prince nodded. "I will." The prince sheathed his sword and bowed slightly. "Thank you for the spar again, Sir Arthur. I must meet with my cousin now." Arthur watched as the prince left the yard, his respect for him growing. Barristan stepped up beside him. "He's good," Barristan said, nodding in approval. Arthur sighed. "He is as good with the sword as Aegon was before he started slacking off and neglecting his training." Barristan looked thoughtful. "Perhaps the king should bring Maekar back to the Red Keep." Arthur shook his head. "Rhaegar believes Maekar to be safe in the north." Arthur thought about how different things would have been if Maekar had stayed in the Red Keep as he had suggested to Rhaegar years ago. Would Maekar and Aegon have been friends like he was with his nephew Robb, or would their relationship? Chapter 20, and then the Stark fleet arrived. Montford Velaryon. Whispering sound. Montford Velaryon stood on the deck of his flagship, the Sea Dragon, his eyes fixed on the horizon. One of their scout ships was returning, and he sent a prayer to the Seven for good news. The situation was dire enough without further setbacks. Prince Aegon had been supposed to lead the fleet, but upon arriving at the Stepstones and learning that Euron Greyjoy had been spotted nearby, he left with 5 ships to rescue his mother from the Mad Greyjoy's clutches. 4 days later, they arrived at the arbor and freed the Redwynes from the Ironborn blockade. The sea was filled with remnants of the Redwyne fleet, which had been attacked in port like the Lannister fleet. They had driven away the Ironborn, but they had not given battle. After stopping by Vineport, they left to chase the Ironborn fleet again. Then, as they approached Mermaid's Palace under the cover of night, they were ambushed by the very fleet they had driven off. To Montford's shock, it was led by Euron Greyjoy himself, who took great pleasure in displaying the captured Prince Aegon. The Ironborn had unleashed wildfire upon them, a move that caused havoc and destruction, even among their own ships. The attack had been brutal but short, with the Ironborn retreating and leaving the royal fleet heavily damaged. They had been forced to dock at the arbor again to repair their ships. The capture of Prince Aegon had dealt a severe blow to the morale of the soldiers and sailors, but they remained determined to rescue the prince from the Ironborn. With the fleet repaired, they set out again. They had learned that the Ironborn had attacked Old Town. Montfort anxiously waited for the scout ship, hoping that Old Town had not fallen to the Ironborn. The presence of wildfire among them worried him greatly. He glanced down at his hands, still bearing the healing burn scars from the previous attack. What can they do to counter such an attack again, he thought. After some time, the scout ship pulled alongside, and a man quickly boarded the sea dragon. "Speak," he ordered, wasting no time. "The Ironborn have a strong presence, but they are spread thin," the scout reported. "Their ships are patrolling the harbor, but the city still holds." He nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and resolve. He signaled the fleet to move, and soon enough, Old Town came into view. Smoke rising from the city painted a grim picture. The Ironborn longships were clearly visible, blockading the harbor and launching periodic assaults against the city's defenses. "Signal Old Town. Let them know we are here," Montfort commanded. Horns blared and flags were raised, sending a clear message to the city's defenders. The Ironborn noticed as well. He saw their ships, sleek and fast, designed for raiding and quick strikes, in stark contrast to the royal fleet, which was larger and more heavily armed. The sea came alive with the sounds of creaking wood, snapping sails, and the shouts of sailors and warriors. The sea dragon led the charge, flanked by other mighty vessels of the royal fleet. As they closed the distance, the first volleys of ballista bolts and flaming arrows were exchanged. The air filled with the sharp twang of crossbows and the roar of flaming projectiles. The larger royal ships ploughed into the Ironborn lines, their reinforced hulls smashing through the lighter longships. Grappling hooks were thrown, and boarding parties leaped across to engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Swords clashed, shields splintered, and the cries of battle echoed across the waters. Ironborn warriors, known for their ferocity and skill in close combat, fought fiercely. They swung their axes and swords with deadly precision, aiming to overwhelm his men. But his men, disciplined and well-armed, met the attack with shields raised and weapons ready. The sea became a maelstrom of activity. Ships collided with thunderous crashes, splintering wood and sending sprays of seawater into the air. Fire spread across the decks of burning ships, and the waters around Old Town were soon littered with debris and bodies. The chaos of battle engulfed everyone involved. Suddenly, the sea dragon was struck by the largest of the Ironborn ships, which had a metal ram affixed to its prow. The impact was devastating, almost splitting the sea dragon in two. The ship shuddered violently, and he struggled to keep his footing. "Ironborn coming!" a sailor shouted, panic in his voice. Montfort drew his sword, preparing for battle as Ironborn raiders swarmed onto the deck. He met the first attacker with a swift slash, his blade cutting through the man's neck. All around him, his men fought desperately to repel the Ironborn, but the Ironborn were relentless, their savage cries filling the air. As he fought off one Ironborn, he saw a massive figure approaching through the chaos of battle. The man was clad in heavy black plate armor, his broad chest and powerful frame making him an imposing sight. He held a steel axe and a shield adorned with the golden crocken of House Greyjoy. Most terrifying of all was his tall black war helm, decorated with an iron crocken that gleamed ominously in the firelight. Victarion Greyjoy, Montfort thought grimly. Victarion let out a thunderous scream and charged into the fray, his axe swinging with deadly precision. He charged at Greyjoy, their weapons clashing with a resounding crash. The force of Victarion's blows sent shockwaves up Montfort's arm, each strike pushing him further back. He parried and countered as best he could, but the Greyjoy's strength was overwhelming. Victarion swung his axe in a brutal arc, and Montfort barely managed to block it with his sword. The impact jarred his arm, nearly making him lose his grip. He struck back, but Victarion deflected the blow with his shield and retaliated with a powerful strike that knocked him to the deck. Gasping for breath, he tried to rise, but Victarion loomed over him, raising his axe for the killing blow. Just as the axe began its descent, a group of Montfort's men tackled the large Ironborn, driving him back and saving him from certain death. It gave Montfort the precious seconds he needed to scramble to his feet. He looked around, seeing chaos everywhere. The sea was filled with blood, the air thick with the sounds of clashing steel and dying men. Ships burned and splintered, their masts falling like felled trees. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the battle's madness. Then he heard a large explosion from the direction of Old Town. Turning his gaze, he saw the horrifying sight of wildfire spreading through the city, its emerald flames licking hungrily at buildings. The base of the citadel was engulfed in the fiery inferno. What madness are these monsters up to? He thought, horror gripping his heart. One of his crew shouted, "Ships incoming!" His heart dropped. If they were more ironborn, then they were surely doomed. But then another cry went up, "Stark colors!" He looked north to see ships bearing the banners of House Stark, and leading the fleet were 5 ships unlike any he had ever seen before. The Stark fleet crashed into the battle with a thunderous roar. The Ironborn were now trapped between the Royal Fleet and the Stark fleet. The Ironborn longships, surrounded and outnumbered, tried desperately to break through the encircling forces. Some managed to escape, but many were boarded, captured, or sunk in the frenzied combat. He saw one of the Stark ships crash into the Iron Victory, sinking it. His own ship was rocked by the collision but remained unscathed. He spotted Victarion Greyjoy, his helm long gone, revealing his twisted, contorted face of fury. With a howl of rage, Victarion came after him again. Montfort readied his sword, bracing himself for the clash. They met in a violent exchange of blows, steel clashing against steel. Victarion's strikes were powerful and relentless, driving Montfort back. He parried and countered, but the Ironborn lord was too strong. He fell to the deck, his sword knocked from his hand. Victarion stood over him again, axe raised for the killing blow. Montfort's eyes widened in fear, but then, with a sickening thud, a spear impaled Victarion through the head, right through his mouth. The Ironborn's eyes went wide in shock before he crumpled to the deck, dead. Montfort looked up to see a man in a wolf-shaped helm and Stark armor standing over him. The man extended a hand, and Montfort took it, pulling himself to his feet. Maekar Targaryen, the man introduced himself. The bastard prince, Montfort thought. But then he quickly corrected himself. No, Prince Maekar. Prince Maekar pulled his sword from its sheath, looking at the spear impaled through Victarion. "I am going to miss that spear," he said with a touch of humor. He turned to his men, his voice commanding. "Kill all the squids. Leave none alive." The Stark men surged onto the ship, clashing with the remaining Ironborn. Montfort, reinvigorated by the prince's arrival, joined the fight with renewed vigor. The battle was fierce, but the tide had turned in their favor. The Ironborn, caught between 2 formidable forces, were quickly overwhelmed. The battle was won.
Thanks for listening.